They thought he was just a farmer. A forgotten man in a forgotten town. But when the storm of corruption and power threatens everything, the quiet hero in the shadows rises, and the cost will be unimaginable. Drop a comment and share where you're joining us from. If stories like this resonate with you, hit subscribe so you don't miss our next inspiring journey. The sun dipped low over the sleepy town of Eagle's Rest, casting golden hues across the endless fields of wheat and corn. At the far edge of town, nestled between rolling hills and dense tree lines, sat a modest farmhouse. Its owner, Logan Hayes, moved with deliberate slowness as he loaded crates of fresh produce onto his battered pickup truck. His worn flannel shirt stretched over a broad chest, and his slightly hunched posture spoke of years carrying burdens, both seen and unseen. To the townsfolk, Logan was just another quiet farmer. A man who had settled in Eagle's Rest nearly a decade ago with little explanation. His hair was graying at the temples, and his belly had softened with time and a life less turbulent than his past. Most people only saw the surface, a reserved man with a steady hand and a keen eye for ripe tomatoes. But Logan was far more than he appeared. Beneath the flannel and faded jeans lay the instincts and skills of a former Delta Force commander, tempered by years of dangerous operations in distant war zones. He climbed into his truck, the engine grumbling to life, and began a short drive to the local farmer's market. Along the way, he passed familiar faces, neighbors tending to livestock, kids riding bikes, and shopkeepers sweeping their front steps. Everyone in Eagle's Rest knew Logan. Or at least they thought they did. He gave a polite nod to Mrs. Callahan as she hung fresh laundry on her line and waved to the Jenkins brothers fixing their tractor. But Logan's mind wasn't on tomatoes or casual greetings. He had been hearing whispers, faint echoes of something sinister brewing on the outskirts of town. Late-night deliveries to the abandoned steel mill. Unmarked black vans slipping down dusty roads under the cover of darkness. The kind of things most folks ignored or dismissed as big city problems trickling into their quiet corner of the world. Arriving at the market, Logan parked his truck and began unloading crates. The other vendors greeted him warmly, and a few loyal customers lined up early to grab his famously crisp lettuce and juicy strawberries. He chatted lightly with a few regulars, keeping his voice calm and demeanor easy. But his sharp eyes constantly scanned the crowd. At a distance, Logan spotted 3 men loitering near the edge of the market square. They weren't locals, he could tell by their leather jackets emblazoned with the snarling serpent logo of the Iron Serpent's motorcycle gang. Their boots were too clean, their postures too stiff for men who belonged in a place like Eagle's Rest. They were watching him, their eyes narrowing every time he glanced their way. Logan kept his focus on his produce stand, expertly bagging vegetables and handling cash. But beneath the surface, his mind was calculating, observing every detail, the bulge under one man's jacket, the way another tapped his fingers rhythmically against his belt buckle. A universal sign among men who carried weapons. Later that afternoon, as Logan packed up what remained of his produce, a familiar face approached his stall. Sheriff Neil Hargrove, a stout man with a permanently furrowed brow and a gut that stretched his uniform shirt, gave Logan a curt nod. "Hayes," the sheriff greeted, adjusting his belt. "Sheriff," Logan replied evenly. Neil leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "You've seen him too, haven't you? The serpents. They've been sniffing around town more lately. Makes my neck hairs stand on end." Logan met Neil's gaze, his expression unreadable. "They're here for a reason. They don't waste time on sightseeing." The sheriff sighed and ran a hand through his thinning hair. "I've got a bad feeling about this, Logan. But there's only so much I can do without concrete proof. Just keep your head down. All right?" Logan nodded but said nothing as the sheriff walked away. Keeping his head down was the last thing he planned to do. As dusk crept over Eagle's Rest, Logan returned to his farmhouse. The familiar creak of the screen door welcomed him as he stepped inside. He moved with purpose through the cozy space. Past framed photos of sunlit fields and dusty bookshelves filled with old novels. Behind a false panel in the pantry lay a hidden compartment, one the average visitor would never notice. Inside were neatly arranged surveillance equipment, encrypted communication devices, and a few weapons that didn't belong on any farm. Logan powered up one of the screens, its greenish glow illuminating his weathered face. He cycled through feeds from hidden cameras placed strategically around the outskirts of town. Tonight, everything looked quiet, but Logan knew better. The stillness was deceptive. The kind that came before a storm. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes sharp as flint as he stared at the screens. Somewhere out there, the iron serpents were making their moves. And he needed to be ready. For now, the quiet farmer of Eagle's Rest would remain in place. But beneath the surface, the old warrior was preparing for the battle ahead. Logan Hayes sat in the dim light of his farmhouse kitchen, a steaming mug of black coffee in hand. The hum of the old refrigerator and the ticking of the wall clock were the only sounds accompanying him. Outside, the moon hung heavy and low over the fields, casting pale light across the weathered wooden porch. Logan's tired eyes stared down at an encrypted tablet resting on the table in front of him. On its glowing screen, a message blinked. Shipment confirmed, Iron Serpents, 48 hours. His jaw tightened as he digested the sparse intel. The message came from Marcus Reed, his handler at the FBI. Marcus was a man of few words, and every message carried weight. The Iron Serpents weren't just running their usual backroom gun deals, this was something bigger. Military-grade weapons, large quantities, and an operation bold enough to move through a place like Eagle's Rest. Whatever was coming, it wasn't going to be subtle. Logan rubbed his face with both hands, his fingers lingering for a moment on the scar near his temple, a souvenir from another life. His mind raced with calculations, routes, possible entry points, and fallback plans. He had lived through enough missions to recognize the early tremors of something catastrophic. He pushed away from the table and moved towards the window. The faint outline of the barn was visible under the moonlight, a structure that held far more than farm equipment and hay bales. Logan knew he would need every inch of his carefully prepared hideaway to deal with what was coming. At sunrise, Logan drove into town again. This time not to sell produce but to gather information. The town square was already stirring with life, shopkeepers unlocking doors, the diner filling with the smell of fresh coffee and bacon, and children chasing each other across the cobblestone plaza. But Logan's eyes weren't on them. He was scanning, watching. The Iron Serpents were here again. 3 of them lounged across the street, leaning against their bikes like apex predators sunning themselves. Caleb Viper Kane stood out among them, a wiry man with sharp, snake-like features and eyes that seemed to dissect everything they fell upon. His leather jacket hung open, and the hilt of a hunting knife peeked from his belt. Logan crossed the plaza deliberately, his worn boots thudding against the pavement. He carried a canvas bag filled with what looked like farm supplies. But inside were carefully placed tools, a small encrypted radio, a burner phone, and a concealed blade. As he passed by Viper and his men, their conversation dropped to a hush. Logan didn't glance their way, but he could feel their eyes tracking him like wolves watching an old elk. "Nice weather we're having, ain't it, farmer?" Viper called out. Logan paused mid-step but didn't turn around. "Weather's always nice this time of year." A low chuckle rippled through the gang. Viper tilted his head. "You sure do spend a lot of time watching people, old man." Makes a guy wonder if you got yourself a hobby. Logan turned slightly. Just enough for them to see the sharp glint in his eye. Farming's my hobby. Kane. Everything else is just background noise. For a moment, the air felt thick. Like the calm before a gunshot. But then Viper grinned. Showing crooked teeth. And waved Logan off with a dismissive flick of his wrist. Logan continued walking. Every muscle in his body tense. He ducked into a narrow alley between the general store and the post office. Then stopped to pull out the burner phone. His fingers moved quickly. Punching in a coded message. Serpents active. Kane present. Expect escalation. The phone chirped once. Confirming the message had been sent. Logan crushed it under his boot and tossed the remains into a nearby trash bin. That evening, Logan met with Marcus Reed via an encrypted video call on his hidden tablet. Marcus. A man in his early 40s with sharp cheekbones and weary eyes. Appeared on the screen. Logan. Marcus began. His voice low and steady. We've confirmed the shipment. It's coming through Eagle's Rest. Likely under the cover of darkness. Kane is organizing it personally. Logan nodded. His brow furrowed. They're sloppy. Too visible. This isn't just about weapons. Is it? Marcus hesitated for a moment before answering. No, it's bigger than that. Intel suggests someone higher up the chain is pushing this operation forward. They want the shipment to succeed at all costs. Logan leaned back in his chair, processing the weight of Marcus's words. Then we make sure it doesn't. Marcus's expression hardened. Local law enforcement is in your corner. But they're stretched thin. Chief Hargrove will do what he can. But this is mostly on you. Logan. Keep a low profile and wait for my signal. The screen went black, leaving Logan staring at his own faint reflection in the glass. Later that night, Logan stood in his barn, surrounded by equipment that no ordinary farmer would own. A tactical map of Eagle's Rest was pinned to the wall, covered in marks and annotations. His weapons, cleaned, loaded, and ready, were laid out neatly on a sturdy wooden table. Outside, the night was still, but Logan could feel the storm brewing. Kane and his iron serpents were drawing closer, and the weight of what was at stake pressed heavy on his chest. The quiet farmer of Eagle's Rest would have to become something else very soon. Logan extinguished the lantern, plunging the barn into darkness. Somewhere in the shadows, a war was about to begin. The low growl of motorcycle engines reverberated across the dusty outskirts of Eagle's Rest as dusk painted the sky in shades of amber and indigo. Logan Hayes stood on the edge of his weathered porch, a steaming mug of coffee cradled in his rough hands. His sharp eyes, shadowed by the brim of his worn cap, tracked the distant convoys snaking down the abandoned county road. There were too many bikes for this to be routine. The iron serpents were getting bolder. Their emblem, a snarling serpent coiled around a rusted dagger, glimmered in the fading light on leather jackets and bike tanks. They rode with purpose. A predatory confidence that spoke volumes. They weren't trying to hide their presence anymore. Logan could feel the pulse of danger in the air, thick and heavy like the smell of rain before a thunderstorm. He took a slow sip of coffee, his mind already mapping out the roads they'd taken, the choke points along the routes, and the potential locations where cargo might be unloaded. His instincts buzzed with unease. Whatever the iron serpents were planning, it was bigger than a typical smuggling run. Inside the farmhouse, Logan retreated to the hidden compartment beneath his pantry floor. The hatch creaked slightly as he lifted it, revealing a carefully concealed operations center. Screens flickered to life as he powered up the surveillance equipment. Tiny green lights glowed along an array of devices, each camera feed, microphone channel, and data log meticulously organized. He adjusted a knob. Zooming in on a distant camera feed pointed toward the old steel mill on the outskirts of town. The mill had been shut down for nearly 2 decades. But now it buzzed with suspicious activity. Trucks, unmarked and heavy, were parked haphazardly in the lot. Men in leather vests and tactical gear moved crates from one vehicle to another. Through the crackling speakers, Logan could hear muffled orders being barked. "Move it. Now. We don't have all night." The scene unfolding in grainy green and black night vision told him everything he needed to know. This wasn't just about smuggling handguns or illicit substances. These crates were heavy. Too heavy for standard contraband. Military hardware. Maybe explosives? He couldn't say for certain yet. But the scale of it felt wrong. Logan leaned back in his chair, rubbing his rough jawline. This wasn't just gang activity, it was coordinated, calculated, and well-funded. Someone far above the Iron Serpents was pulling the strings. The faint chime of an incoming message pinged on his encrypted tablet. Logan swiped the screen and Marcus Reed's name flashed at the top. Activity confirmed. Iron Serpents mobilizing. Eyes open. Logan. Expect escalation. Logan's jaw tightened. Marcus had been his handler for years. A man who spoke plainly and rarely minced words. If Marcus was telling him to expect escalation, it meant things were already spiraling beyond local containment. Later that evening, Logan climbed into his rusted pickup truck and started the engine. The headlights cut through the darkness as he made his way toward the edge of town. Tires crunching gravel with every turn. His destination was a high ridge overlooking the steel mill, a place he'd scouted months ago and outfitted with a hidden observation post. The night was quiet except for the distant chirp of crickets and the occasional howl of a coyote. Logan crouched behind a rocky outcrop, his binoculars steady in his calloused hands. From his vantage point, he could see the mill sprawled below, bathed in pale moonlight and faint orange glows from portable floodlights. Men moved in synchronized patterns, unloading crates with military precision. Caleb Viper Kane stood in the center of it all, barking orders with sharp gestures. Even from this distance, Logan could see the glint of the knife hilt strapped to Viper's belt. There was something in the way Viper moved, a predatory grace combined with an edge of volatility. Kane wasn't just a street thug in leather, he was a tactician. And that made him dangerous. As Logan watched, one of the trucks pulled away, its heavy tires kicking up clouds of dust. It headed north, away from town, and toward the forested back roads. Logan made a mental note of the direction before slipping away into the night. Back at his farmhouse, Logan reviewed the footage captured from his remote cameras. The Iron Serpent's pattern of activity was becoming clearer. They were unloading and dispersing. The weapons, or whatever was in those crates, were being funneled out in smaller shipments. But the big question remained, why Eagle's Rest? Why use this quiet, isolated town as a hub? The soft creak of his farmhouse door broke his concentration. Logan's hand instinctively went to the pistol tucked at his hip. He rose silently and moved toward the door, his boots barely making a sound against the wooden floorboards. But it was only Sheriff Neil Hargrove standing there, his flashlight cutting thin beams through the darkness. "Hayes," the sheriff said, his voice low. "We need to talk." Logan stepped aside, letting the sheriff in. Neil's face was pale, his brow glistening with sweat. "They're all over town, Logan. These Iron Serpent boys. More of them keep rolling in every day. And Kane, he's got that look, like he's building up to something." Logan nodded. "He is. They're not just passing through. Neil, this place, Eagle's Rest, it's important to them for some reason." Neil's shoulders slumped slightly, and he looked around the farmhouse before speaking again. The feds know about this. Right? You're still talking to them? I am, Logan said firmly. The sheriff's gaze lingered on Logan for a moment. And then he nodded. All right. Whatever it is you're planning, just don't get yourself killed. I can't clean up that mess. Neil turned and walked back out into the night, leaving Logan alone in the quiet farmhouse. As Logan stared at the tactical map spread across his dining table, he felt the weight of what was coming settle onto his shoulders. The Iron Serpents weren't just a gang, they were a symptom of something larger. Something that reached far beyond the dusty streets of Eagle's Rest. The storm was rolling in, and Logan Hayes was standing right in its path. The morning sun crept over the horizon, spilling weak golden light over Eagle's Rest. Logan Hayes pulled his truck into the town square, the old engine rattling as he parked near the farmer's market. Crates of fresh vegetables and fruits sat in the back. But Logan's focus wasn't on his produce. His sharp eyes scanned the growing crowd, noting who was there, and more importantly, who didn't belong. The Iron Serpents had begun to infest the town like weeds in fertile soil. They lingered at street corners, leaned against storefronts, and parked their bikes in chaotic lines outside the diner. Their leather jackets, emblazoned with the snarling serpent logo, caught the light as they swaggered through the market. Logan stepped out of his truck, his boots hitting the pavement with a solid thud. He hoisted a crate of vegetables onto his shoulder and moved towards his stall, keeping his head low but his senses sharp. The weight of his sidearm, hidden beneath his jacket, was a silent comfort. The market was busier than usual, but the hum of conversation carried a nervous undercurrent. People avoided eye contact with the bikers. Vendors spoke in hushed tones, their eyes darting over shoulders. Fear had begun to take root. Logan set down his crate and began arranging produce on the wooden table. Carrots, tomatoes, fresh lettuce. His hands moved automatically, but his attention was elsewhere. Across the square, Caleb Viper Kane emerged from the crowd. His wiry frame was wrapped in a cracked leather jacket, and his boots clicked against the pavement as he walked. His eyes, cold and sharp, scanned the market like a predator sizing up prey. Two hulking gang members flanked him, their presence radiating menace. Logan didn't flinch as Viper approached his stall. The gang leader picked up an apple, turning it slowly in his gloved hand before taking a casual bite. "Morning, farmer," Viper drawled, his voice smooth but edged with danger. "Business looks good. Must be nice. Pulling in all this cash while the rest of the world struggles." Logan met his gaze steadily. "Just honest work, Kane. Nothing more. Nothing less." Viper's grin widened, but his eyes remained ice cold. "See, that's the thing about honest work, Logan. It doesn't always pay off unless someone makes sure it does. You know, protection costs money." The crowd had gone silent around them. People pretended not to watch, but every ear was tuned to the conversation. Logan's voice was low and even. "I don't need your protection." One of the gang members stepped forward, knocking over a crate of tomatoes with a swift kick. Bright red fruit splattered across the cobblestone ground. Viper raised a hand, halting his man. Now. No need to make a mess. Farmer Hayes here is just a little stubborn." Before Logan could reply, a voice cut through the tension. "That's enough, Kane." Sheriff Neil Hargrove strode into the market square, hand resting firmly on the grip of his revolver. His brow was furrowed, and his voice carried the authority of a man used to being obeyed. Viper straightened, his grin never faltering. "Sheriff Hargrove, always showing up at the most inconvenient times." Neil stopped a few feet away, his posture tense but controlled. You and your boys have made your point. Now pack it up and move along. For a moment, it seemed like Viper might push back. But then he smirked, tossed the half-eaten apple onto Logan's table, and took a step back. Relax, Sheriff. Just having a friendly chat with our local farmer here. With a mock salute, Viper turned on his heel, his men following him as they sauntered back toward their motorcycles. The tension in the market square slowly began to dissipate. But the damage was already done. The fear lingered in the eyes of every person present. Neil turned to Logan. You all right? Logan nodded. I'm fine. The sheriff's voice lowered. They're pushing harder every day. And the folks here, they're scared. Logan. Real scared. I know. Logan replied quietly. Neil gave a curt nod and walked away, his broad shoulders tense as he headed back to his patrol car. That evening, Logan returned to his farmhouse. The sun dipped below the horizon, and long shadows stretched across the fields. He parked his truck in the barn and locked the heavy doors behind him. Inside, the air was cool and still. He descended into his hidden command center, where the glow of surveillance monitors illuminated his face. He cycled through the feeds, street corners, back alleys, the steel mill. On one of the screens, he spotted movement. A black SUV, windows tinted, pulled up near the mill. 3 men in tactical gear stepped out, their movements precise and coordinated. They weren't iron serpents, they were something else entirely. Logan leaned closer, his eyes narrowing. The pieces were beginning to fall into place. But the picture they formed was even more troubling than he had anticipated. This wasn't just about a gang running weapons, it was about something larger. Something more dangerous. His encrypted tablet buzzed. Another message from Marcus Reed. Logan. Stay sharp. Higher-ups are watching this operation closely. Any misstep could blow the lid off this thing. Logan set the tablet down and exhaled slowly. Every instinct in his body screamed that time was running out. He stood and moved toward a locked cabinet. Inside were weapons, carefully maintained firearms, combat knives, and tactical gear. Logan selected a pistol, checked the magazine, and holstered it at his side. Outside, the night was calm, but Logan could feel the storm growing stronger. The iron serpents were pushing harder. The mysterious operatives were closing in. An eagle's rest was caught in the middle. As Logan turned off the lights in his hidden room, the faint sound of motorcycle engines echoed in the distance. The storm wasn't coming anymore, it was already here. The faint glow of Logan Hayes' surveillance monitors bathed the darkened room in a cold light. Outside, the night was quiet, save for the distant hum of crickets and the occasional snap of twigs in the woods surrounding his farmhouse. Logan sat hunched over his encrypted tablet, his sharp eyes scanning a stream of intelligence reports sent by his FBI contact. Marcus Reed. Shipment confirmed, 24 hours. Activity increasing. Eyes open. Hayes. The message was brief, but it carried weight. The iron serpents weren't slowing down. If anything, they were ramping up their movements. Logan could feel the storm clouds gathering. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling a slow breath, his mind already calculating possible routes, choke points, and contingencies. There was one undeniable fact: he couldn't do this alone. His calloused fingers reached for an old burner phone tucked away in a metal lockbox. The device was ancient by modern standards, but it was secure. Logan hesitated for just a moment before dialing a number he had committed to memory long ago. It rang twice before a gravelly voice answered. Hayes? Well, hell, I thought you were dead. Logan allowed a ghost of a smile to cross his face. Not yet, Carter. But I might be soon if I don't get some help. Carter Owens, a man whose name carried weight in certain circles. A former special operations officer. Like Logan. And one of the few people Logan still trusted with his life. Talk to me, Carter said, his tone shifting from casual banter to sharp focus. Iron Serpents. Shipment coming in tomorrow night. It's big. Carter, military-grade big. This isn't just biker nonsense. There's someone with deep pockets and government strings pulling them. I need another set of hands. Someone I can count on. There was a pause on the other end before Carter replied. Send me the coordinates. I'll be there by nightfall. The line went dead. But Logan felt a flicker of relief. Carter was the kind of man who didn't make promises lightly. Night fell heavily over Eagle's Rest. The pale moon casting silvery light across the fields. Logan stood near the edge of an old forest road. The glow of his truck's headlights cutting through the darkness. His arms were crossed. His stance rigid and watchful. The distant hum of an approaching engine grew louder. Moments later, a sleek black SUV rolled into view. Tires crunching over gravel. The vehicle came to a stop. And the driver's side door opened. Carter Owens stepped out. Dressed in dark tactical clothing. A rugged duffel bag slung over one shoulder. His hair was grayer than Logan remembered. And the scars on his face seemed deeper. But his piercing blue eyes were just as sharp. Logan. Carter greeted. His voice low but steady. You look like hell. Logan let out a dry chuckle. Thanks for the vote of confidence. The two men shook hands firmly. A silent exchange of trust passing between them. Let's cut to it, Carter said, dropping the duffel bag on the ground and unzipping it. Inside was an arsenal, tactical rifles, handguns, ammo, night vision goggles, and other tools of their old trade. Logan knelt beside the bag, inspecting the equipment with a practiced eye. We've got 24 hours. The shipment is moving through the steel mill tomorrow night. I've got surveillance on the mill. And the sheriff's department is stretched thin. If we're gonna stop this, it's going to be us. Carter nodded, his lips pressing into a thin line. We'll need to set up choke points. Force them into tight spaces. Limit their mobility. You've got maps? Logan walked Carter back to his truck, where a large tactical map was spread across the hood. Roads, buildings, and observation points were marked in red ink. Here, here, and here. Logan pointed, tracing routes with his finger. They'll likely split the convoy into smaller groups once they hit this intersection. We'll need to intercept before they scatter. Carter studied the map, his brow furrowing. This isn't just about stopping some shipment, Logan. This is about sending a message. Whoever's pulling these strings, they need to know this town isn't easy prey. Logan met Carter's gaze. We're not just fighting bikers. We're fighting the people standing behind them. But we can't let that shipment disappear into the night. If it does, we lose whatever slim chance we have at figuring out who's really behind this. Carter zipped the duffel bag closed and hoisted it onto his shoulder. All right then. Let's set the trap. Back at Logan's farmhouse, the two men worked through the night. Carter assembled weapons with methodical precision while Logan monitored the live camera feeds from his hidden surveillance system. The steel mill was alive with activity, trucks moving in and out. Men shouting orders. Crates being stacked. The Iron Serpents weren't trying to hide anymore. Logan leaned back in his chair and rubbed his temples. They're getting sloppy. Arrogant. They think they've already won. Carter smirked faintly as he cleaned the barrel of a rifle. Good. That'll make them easier to take down. The farmhouse was silent for a moment, save for the occasional beep from the surveillance equipment. Then Logan spoke, his voice low but firm. We're walking into hell tomorrow night. Carter. You still good with this? Carter snapped a magazine into place and gave Logan a hard look. We've been in hell before. Hayes. The only difference now is the view. Logan let out a small, humorless laugh. The weight of what was to come settled on both men like a heavy fog. The night stretched on, and the two old soldiers prepared for the battle ahead. Somewhere out there, the Iron Serpents and their mysterious backers were moving their pieces into place. But Logan Hayes and Carter Owens were ready. In the quiet farmhouse surrounded by endless fields, the storm was gathering, and Logan knew it would break soon. The sky above Eagle's Rest was painted with the soft hues of dawn as Logan Hayes stood on his porch, a mug of black coffee warming his hands. The horizon was barely lit, but his sharp eyes scanned the landscape, taking in every shadow, every flicker of movement. In the distance, he spotted the faint glint of headlights moving along the forest road. Sheriff Neil Hargrove was arriving. Moments later, the sheriff's cruiser came to a stop in front of the farmhouse, kicking up a thin cloud of dust. Neil stepped out, his hand resting on his belt as he approached. His face was lined with fatigue, his eyes heavy with the weight of responsibility. Morning, Neil, Logan said, his voice low. Morning, Logan. Neil sighed, adjusting his belt. I barely got any sleep last night. These serpents are everywhere. My deputies are running themselves ragged trying to keep up. Logan nodded, already expecting that answer. It's only going to get worse if we don't stop that shipment tonight. Neil ran a hand over his face, then looked at Logan squarely. You've got a plan, don't you? Logan motioned for Neil to follow him inside. In the dim glow of the surveillance monitors, Carter Owens was already awake, standing over the tactical map spread across the dining table. Sheriff, Carter greeted with a curt nod. Neil's eyes flickered to the map, then to the array of weapons and tactical gear neatly organized nearby. This feels bigger than just a gang problem. Logan, you two aren't treating this like some local scuffle. What the hell are we dealing with here? Logan pointed to the live feed from the steel mill on one of the monitors. Shadowy figures moved in and out of floodlit areas, loading crates into trucks. This isn't just about guns or drugs. Neil, someone with resources, real resources, is pulling the strings. These crates aren't standard contraband. They're military-grade shipments, and they're moving them through our town. Neil's face paled slightly as he took in the screen. You think this goes higher up? Like federal level higher up? Carter spoke up, his voice firm. We don't think. Sheriff, we know. Whoever's behind this isn't some street thug. This is organized, funded, and protected. Neil sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. All right. What do you need from me? Logan handed Neil a detailed map marked with red XS and arrows. We've identified choke points along the mill's access routes. I need your men positioned here. Here. And here. But listen carefully. Neil, do not engage unless absolutely necessary. Your deputies aren't equipped for this fight. Their job is to contain, not confront. Neil studied the map, then gave a slow nod. Understood. I'll have my best men in place. But Logan, if this goes sideways, there's no coming back from it. Logan's expression was hard as stone. It won't. As the sheriff departed, the farmhouse settled into a tense quiet. Carter began methodically double-checking their weapons and gear while Logan monitored the live feeds. each second ticking closer to the inevitable confrontation. The sun was higher in the sky when Marcus Reed's message arrived on Logan's encrypted tablet. Hayes. Final confirmation, shipment moves at 2,200 hours. Kane will be there in person. Keep your head low. And don't leave anything traceable. Logan showed the message to Carter, who let out a low whistle. If Kane's showing up in person, that means this shipment's critical. We nail this. And we might just rip the mask off whoever's bankrolling these guys. Logan nodded. It also means they'll be ready for trouble. The two men fell into a rhythm of preparation, checking ammunition, syncing radios, and finalizing their positions on the tactical map. Each movement was precise. Each detail accounted for. As twilight crept across the sky, Logan walked out to his porch one last time. The world was still and quiet. The faint orange glow of the sun dipping below the horizon. It felt like the calm before the storm. Carter stepped up beside him, his silhouette framed by the fading light. You know, Logan, there's no shame in walking away from a fight you can't win. Logan didn't respond immediately. He took a deep breath, his gaze fixed on the horizon. This town's been my home for 8 years. Carter. These people, they trust me. They don't deserve to become pawns in someone else's war. Carter gave a slow nod. All right. Then, let's make sure they don't. Night fell swiftly over Eagle's Rest. The farmhouse was cloaked in darkness, save for the faint glow of monitors flickering in the hidden command center. Logan and Carter were dressed in dark tactical gear, blending into the shadows as they loaded their weapons and secured their equipment. The radio crackled softly as Neil's voice came through. Hayes. We're in position. Roads are locked down. No movement yet. Over. Logan pressed the transmit button. Copy that. Sheriff. Hold your ground and wait for our signal. Over. The men climbed into Logan's truck, the engine growling softly as they pulled away from the farmhouse and disappeared into the night. The steel mill awaited them, its floodlights glowing faintly in the distance like the eyes of some waiting predator. As they approached the outskirts of the mill, Logan killed the headlights, and the truck coasted silently to a stop. The two men exited, weapons in hand, and disappeared into the tall grass lining the perimeter fence. Through his night vision goggles, Logan spotted movement, dozens of armed men patrolling the area, crates being stacked, and Kane himself standing near one of the trucks, barking orders. Carter whispered, "This is it, Logan. Once we start, there's no turning back." Logan's voice was steady and calm. "Then let's make every shot count." In the shadow of the steel mill, two seasoned warriors prepared to face an army. The fate of Eagle's Rest, and perhaps something far larger, hung in the balance. The storm had arrived. The night was thick with silence, broken only by the faint rustle of leaves carried by the cold breeze sweeping across Logan Hayes' farmhouse. The pale light of the crescent moon painted silver outlines along the edges of the barn, the silo, and the old wooden fence surrounding his land. Somewhere in the distance, an owl hooted, a brief, haunting sound swallowed quickly by the weight of the night. Logan knelt behind a reinforced barrier near his barn, his knees pressed against the cool earth. His night vision goggles buzzed faintly as they amplified the shadows moving in the distance. A dozen figures, armed, disciplined, and deliberate, were creeping across the edge of his property. Their flashlights flickered briefly before cutting off again, their beams slicing through the dark like knives. The iron serpents had arrived. From the way they moved, Logan could tell this wasn't a reckless raid. These weren't common thugs. And they weren't here to make noise, they were here to eliminate him. Their careful movements, the silent hand signals exchanged between them, and their spread-out formation spoke of training far beyond street-level gangsters. Logan's voice was a low whisper as he pressed the radio to his lips. "Carter. They're here. Moving in from the north and east. Looks like they're trying to box me in." Carter Owen's voice crackled back through the earpiece. "Copy that. Logan. I've got 3 targets moving along the tree line on the north ridge. I can take them if they get too close." Logan adjusted his grip on his rifle. His gloved hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. He could feel it, the tightening knot in his stomach. The slow burn of focus narrowing his vision. Every sense was heightened. Every breath controlled. His eyes flicked back to the advancing shadows. One serpent separated slightly from the others. Likely scouting ahead. Logan aimed. Exhaled. And squeezed the trigger. A suppressed shot cut through the night. And the figure dropped soundlessly into the grass. The other serpents froze, their heads snapping in the direction of their fallen comrade. Then came the inevitable, the rapid bark of orders. Flashlights flicking back on. And weapons being raised. "They're on to me." Logan muttered into the radio. "I'm falling back to the farmhouse. Cover me." "Carter." "Understood." Carter replied calmly. Logan moved swiftly, keeping low as he dashed across the open ground. Behind him, a burst of gunfire erupted. Bullets chewing through wooden fence posts and ricocheting off metal tools left scattered near the barn. Dirt kicked up around his boots as he sprinted toward cover. Carter's rifle cracked twice from his elevated position on the ridge. And 2 more serpents went down. The gang members scattered, shouting commands and trying to locate Carter's position. For a brief moment, chaos reigned among them. Logan slid behind an overturned tractor, his chest heaving as he reloaded his rifle. He took a quick glance around the edge, counting silhouettes as they regrouped. "Logan. They're splitting into 2 teams." Carter's voice cut through the static. "One's pushing toward the farmhouse. The other's circling to flank from the west." Logan's brow furrowed as he processed the information. They weren't just reacting, they were coordinating. Whoever was leading this raid knew what they were doing. "Copy that. Hold your position. Carter. Keep picking them off when you can. But don't let them zero in on you." Logan reached down, unclipping a small device from his belt, a remote trigger linked to a series of perimeter traps he had set up weeks ago. He flipped the safety cover and pressed the button. A sharp pop echoed across the field, followed by a flash of bright light and a chorus of confused shouts. The improvised explosive device hadn't been lethal, but it had been enough to disorient and scatter the team advancing from the west. Logan used the brief window to reposition, darting toward the farmhouse. His boots hit the wooden porch steps just as another round of bullets tore through the air, splintering the railing behind him. He ducked through the door and slammed it shut, bolting it with a heavy metal latch. The farmhouse was dark, save for the faint glow of the surveillance monitors in the hidden command center beneath the floorboards. From his position inside, Logan could hear the distant crack of Carter's rifle and the scattered shouts of the serpents regrouping outside. The enemy was still out there, still determined. Logan pressed his back against the wall, gripping his rifle tightly. His breathing was slow, controlled. He knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. The storm had reached his doorstep, and Logan Hayes was prepared to meet it head-on. Logan Hayes crouched low behind an overturned dining table, his rifle steady in his hands. The faint glow from the surveillance monitors in the hidden command center beneath the farmhouse cast eerie shadows across the walls. Outside, the distant crack of Carter Owen's rifle echoed through the night, cutting through the chaos like a metronome of precision. Through the thin wooden walls, Logan could hear the muffled shouts of the iron serpents as they regrouped. The gang members were moving carefully now, coordinating their advance with disciplined intent. The sharp crunch of boots on gravel and the faint creak of floorboards outside told him all he needed to know. They were closing in. His radio crackled softly, Carter's voice cutting through the static. "Logan. I count 6 remaining near the south side of the barn. 2 more are circling back towards the kitchen entrance. They're spreading thin. But they're not panicked. You need to be ready." Logan nodded to himself. "Copy that. Carter. Hold your ground. I'll deal with the ones inside." He moved quietly across the farmhouse's dimly lit interior, stepping over broken glass and splintered wood. Each creak of the floorboards felt deafening in the tense silence. As he reached the hallway, Logan spotted faint movement through the broken back window. A serpent climbed through, his silhouette sharp against the pale moonlight. Logan's finger tightened on the trigger, and with a soft pop, the suppressed rifle barked once. The intruder collapsed soundlessly, his body slumping against the wall. But the silence didn't last. A loud crash came from the front door as 2 serpents burst in, their rifles raised and flashlights cutting through the shadows. Logan darted into the adjacent room, ducking low as bullets chewed through the doorframe behind him. "Move up," one of the serpents barked. Logan grabbed a smoke grenade from his vest, pulled the pin, and rolled it into the hallway. Thick plumes of gray smoke erupted, filling the narrow corridor. The gang members hesitated for a split second, coughing as the smoke choked their vision. Logan used the moment to strike. He emerged from the side room, rifle steady, and dropped the first serpent with a well-placed shot to the chest. The second turned toward him, his flashlight briefly illuminating Logan's face. The 2 men locked eyes for a fraction of a second before Logan fired again. The serpent crumpled to the floor. The farmhouse fell silent once more, save for the distant echoes of Carter's rifle fire and the sharp intake of Logan's breath. He knew there were still more outside, and it was only a matter of time before they regrouped and tried again. The radio crackled. "Logan. Heads up. They're bringing in reinforcements from the tree line. Looks like another 3 moving toward your back porch. I'm repositioning to get a better angle." Logan moved quickly, reloading his rifle and grabbing an extra magazine from his belt. He made his way to the kitchen window, peering out into the darkness. 3 shapes moved carefully through the moonlit yard, weapons raised and flashlights off. They were disciplined, clearly following orders from someone who knew how to lead men into combat. Logan gritted his teeth. These weren't just bikers. Whoever was training these serpents had a military background, and it showed. As the trio reached the edge of the porch, Logan braced his rifle against the window frame and fired. The first man went down instantly. The second spun around, trying to return fire but catching a shot in the shoulder. The third dove for cover behind a stack of old barrels, firing wildly in Logan's direction. Bullets shattered the window glass, forcing Logan to duck low. Shards of glass rained down around him as wood splintered and plaster cracked. Outside, Carter's rifle barked again, and the third serpent fell sideways, his body limp against the barrels. Logan exhaled slowly, his rifle still raised as he scanned the yard for any remaining movement. The radio crackled to life again. "Logan. We've thinned them out, but they're pulling back. Looks like they've realized this isn't going to be as easy as they thought. Watch your 6, I don't think they're done yet." Logan moved carefully back to the center of the farmhouse, stepping over the bodies of the fallen serpents. His chest heaved with controlled breaths, and his rifle remained steady in his hands. Through one of the broken windows, he could see faint headlights approaching from the distance. Sheriff Neil Hargrove's cruiser, followed by 2 more squad cars, came into view. The cavalry had arrived. Logan keyed his radio. "Carter. Neil's here. Stay in position and keep an eye on the perimeter. I'll meet the sheriff. Outside. The squad cars screeched to a stop. And Neil emerged with his revolver drawn. His face etched with worry and determination. "Logan!" Neil called out as he approached the farmhouse. "You all right?" Logan nodded. His rifle lowered but still in his grip. "I'm in one piece. They've pulled back for now. But they'll regroup. This isn't over." "Sheriff." Neil scanned the carnage, the broken windows, the scattered bodies of the gang members, and the smoldering remnants of Logan's traps. "We'll secure the area and sweep for stragglers. But you're right, they'll be back." Logan's expression was grim as he looked out across the darkened fields. The Iron Serpents weren't done. And neither was their mysterious backer. The night had been won. But the war was far from over. The acrid scent of gunpowder hung heavy in the air as Logan Hayes stepped over shattered glass and splintered wood. His farmhouse, once a sanctuary, now felt like a battlefield. The faint glow of headlights outside signaled that Sheriff Neil Hargrove and his deputies were sweeping the property. The red and blue flashes of police cruisers cast fleeting shadows across the wreckage. Logan's rifle was still gripped tightly in his hands as he peered out the broken window. Beyond the perimeter, the Iron Serpents were gone, at least for now. But Logan knew better than to assume they wouldn't return. These men had purpose, direction, and funding. Whoever was pulling their strings wouldn't accept failure lightly. The farmhouse door creaked open, and Sheriff Neil Hargrove stepped inside, his flashlight cutting a thin beam through the smoke-filled air. His revolver was still drawn, though his grip had loosened. "Logan," Neil said cautiously, his voice rough from exhaustion. "The area's secure. But we've got bodies everywhere. My deputies are sweeping for any stragglers. But it looks like they've pulled back. For now." Logan lowered his rifle, nodding once. "They'll regroup." "Sheriff." This wasn't a random raid, it was an execution order. Neil's tired eyes scanned the ruined interior of the farmhouse, the bullet holes peppering the walls, the shattered furniture, and the blood stains soaking into the wooden floorboards. "You all right, Hayes?" Neil asked quietly. Logan exhaled slowly, still breathing. From the corner of the room, Carter Owens emerged, his silhouette sharp in the dim light. His rifle was slung across his chest, and a smear of dirt ran across his cheek. He glanced briefly at Neil before addressing Logan. "They were better trained than I expected," Carter said flatly. "Whoever's funding these guys isn't hiring amateurs. This was a test, Logan. They wanted to see how hard we'd fight back." Neil's brow furrowed. "A test? You think they'll come back stronger?" Carter nodded grimly. "Without a doubt. They'll bring more men, heavier firepower, and tighter coordination. Whoever Kane is answering to doesn't care about casualties, they care about results." Neil ran a hand down his face, the weight of the situation pressing down on his shoulders. "All right. We'll double patrols around town, keep the roads monitored, and set up checkpoints." "But Logan," he hesitated, his voice softening. "This town isn't equipped for war. If this keeps escalating, I don't know how long we'll hold." Logan locked eyes with the sheriff. "Then we end it before it escalates any further. We can't let that shipment leave Eagle's Rest. Neil, if it gets out, it's gone forever. Whatever they're planning, it'll be too late to stop." Neil hesitated, then nodded. "I'll do what I can on my end. But Logan, be careful." With a final glance around the farmhouse, Neil turned and walked back out into the night, barking orders to his deputies as he went. underscore 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 underscore. Once the house had fallen into a tense silence, Logan and Carter retreated to the hidden command center beneath the farmhouse. The monitors glowed softly, showing live feeds from Logan's network of surveillance cameras placed across the outskirts of Eagle's Rest. The steel mill, the back roads, the tree lines, they were all under watch. Carter leaned over one of the screens, his brow furrowed. They weren't just looking for a fight, Logan. They were looking for you. Someone tipped them off, someone knows you're in their way. Logan sat heavily in his chair, his shoulders sagging slightly from the weight of exhaustion. That means we're running out of time. He tapped a finger against one of the monitors, focusing on the steel mill. The camera feed showed increased activity, more trucks arriving, more crates being unloaded, and more men with rifles patrolling the perimeter. They're gearing up, Logan said, his voice low. Whatever's in those crates is worth a fortune, and it's not something they want falling into the wrong hands. Carter straightened, his expression hardening. Then we hit them before they're ready. A preemptive strike. Take out the shipment. Cut their legs out from under them before they can move. Logan looked at him, his eyes sharp. It won't be clean, Carter. There's no way we get through that place without a fight. Carter smirked faintly. Since when have you ever cared about clean, Logan? Despite himself, Logan let out a dry chuckle. But the moment passed quickly, and the weight of what was coming settled back onto his shoulders. We'll need Neil's men to block off the roads, Logan said, pulling out a detailed map of the steel mill and surrounding terrain. If we can funnel them into the southern access road, we might be able to box them in. But if even one truck slips past us, it's over. Carter nodded. We'll need explosives to take out the bridge on the south route. I'll rig them tonight. Logan leaned back, staring at the map. His mind was already calculating odds, probabilities, and outcomes. The weight of responsibility pressed down on him, but he pushed it aside. There was no room for doubt. This ends tomorrow night, Logan said firmly. Carter met his gaze and nodded. Then let's make sure we're ready. The farmhouse settled into a tense stillness as the two men prepared for what was to come. Outside, the faint glow of dawn began to creep over the horizon, casting pale light over the battered farmhouse and the blood-stained ground. The iron serpents would return. And when they did, Logan Hayes and Carter Owens would be waiting. The storm wasn't over, it was only just beginning. The faint light of dawn crept over the horizon, casting long shadows across Logan Hayes' battered farmhouse. Smoke from smoldering wood and gunpowder still hung heavy in the air, a grim reminder of the night before. Logan stood by the shattered window frame, one hand resting on the cold steel barrel of his rifle, the other clutching a chipped mug of lukewarm coffee. His sharp eyes scanned the edge of his property, watching for any sign of movement. Behind him, Carter Owens sat at the kitchen table, breaking down his rifle piece by piece with calm precision. His scarred hands moved with mechanical efficiency, each motion deliberate. Neither man spoke for a long while, the silence filled with the distant sounds of wind rustling through charred trees. You know they'll come back, Carter said finally, his voice low but steady. That wasn't just a show of force, they were probing us, testing how far we'd push back. Logan nodded, his jaw tight. They know what they're up against now. They won't make the same mistakes twice. The farmhouse door creaked open, and Sheriff Neil Hargrove stepped inside. He looked worse than the night before. His face pale and drawn. Dark circles etched beneath his eyes. His uniform was stained with dirt and sweat. His holster hanging loose at his side. "Morning, Sheriff," Logan said without turning. Neil sighed, removing his hat and running a hand through his thinning hair. "Morning, Logan. Carter. The deputies have been sweeping the outskirts all night. But there's no sign of the serpents. They've pulled back for now. But..." He paused, his voice dropping. "They're regrouping. You can feel it in the air." Logan finally turned to face Neil, his expression grim. "We're not dealing with just a gang here, Sheriff. These men are trained, coordinated. Someone's giving them orders, and those orders are coming from high up." Carter spoke without looking up from his rifle. "They've got funding, logistics, and a purpose. Kane's just a middleman. The real power is somewhere else." Neil let out a shaky breath and sat down heavily in one of the wooden chairs. "So what do we do? Logan? You've been in situations like this before. Where do we start?" Logan walked over to the dining table and unrolled a detailed map of Eagle's Rest and the surrounding areas. Red circles and arrows were scrawled across key locations, roads, choke points, supply routes. His finger tapped lightly on one particular spot near the edge of town. "There's an old warehouse on the east side, right near the rail line. I've seen activity there over the last few days, trucks moving in and out. Men guarding the perimeter. It's not just storage, it's an operational hub." Neil leaned over the map, squinting at the marked location. "You think Kane's there?" Logan's gaze was hard. "If he's not there, someone who knows more about this operation is. Either way, we need to hit that warehouse before they can regroup." Carter set down his rifle and stood, crossing his arms over his chest. "If we move on that warehouse, we can't afford to make noise. We'll need to go in quiet, extract whatever intel we can, and get out before they know what hit them." Neil hesitated, his brow furrowed. "You two are walking into a hornet's nest. You know that, right?" Logan locked eyes with him. "We don't have a choice, Sheriff. If we wait, they'll bury whatever they're hiding there, and we'll lose our chance to stop this before it's too late." The weight of the moment hung heavy in the air. Neil nodded slowly, pushing himself up from the chair. "I'll keep my men on the outskirts. Make sure no one slips through. But you two, you'd better come back in one piece." The sun had risen higher by the time Logan and Carter geared up. Carter strapped on a tactical vest over his dark jacket, his sidearm holstered securely at his hip. Logan checked the magazine in his rifle one last time before slinging it over his shoulder. The two men stood by Logan's rusted pickup truck, the cool morning breeze cutting through the rising heat. Carter broke the silence. "You know, Logan, back in the day, we had teams for this kind of thing. Air support, comms, an exit plan. Now it's just two old dogs and a pickup truck." Logan smirked faintly. "And yet, somehow, I trust us more." They climbed into the truck, the engine growling to life as Logan turned the ignition. Dust kicked up behind them as they headed down the winding dirt road that led out of Logan's farm and toward the outskirts of Eagle's Rest. The drive was quiet, both men lost in their thoughts. Fields turned into skeletal remains of old factories and forgotten warehouses. The closer they got to their destination, the more the landscape felt suffocated, choked by decay and neglect. When they finally reached the edge of the warehouse property, Logan parked the truck behind a line of overgrown bushes. They could see the building from their vantage point, a hulking structure of rusted metal and broken windows. Several trucks were parked nearby, and armed men patrolled the perimeter. Logan pulled a pair of binoculars from his pack and scanned the area. They're not expecting us. At least. Not yet. Carter crouched low beside him, inspecting the layout. Entrance on the south side looks like the best option. Fewer guards. Logan nodded. We move fast. We move quiet. Anything that looks like intel, documents, hard drives. Anything, we take it. We don't get greedy. And we don't get caught. The two men exchanged a final nod before slipping into the shadows. Their weapons ready. The warehouse loomed ahead. A dark and silent fortress. Whatever secrets it held, Logan was determined to uncover them before it was too late. The warehouse loomed like a sleeping giant under the pale moonlight. Its rusted walls streaked with grime and its shattered windows glowing faintly from flickering floodlights inside. Logan Hayes and Carter Owens crouched low behind a stack of discarded pallets, their breath misting in the cold night air. Through his binoculars, Logan scanned the perimeter. Four guards patrolled lazily near the main entrance, rifles slung over their shoulders. Another pair lingered near a side door, smoking and chatting in low voices. 6 outside. Probably more inside. Logan whispered. We'll take the south entrance, quieter. Less light. If we can get inside without raising an alarm, we might be able to figure out what they're moving here. Carter gave a curt nod, his hand resting on the grip of his sidearm. Let's move. The two men slipped through the darkness, their boots making no sound on the gravel-strewn ground. They hugged the shadows, skirting around the edge of the warehouse until they reached the south entrance. The faint sound of machinery hummed from within, accompanied by occasional bursts of sharp laughter. Logan knelt by the door, examining the lock. It was newer than he expected, commercial grade, but not impenetrable. With practiced efficiency, he pulled a small lock-picking kit from his pocket and worked the mechanism. 5 seconds. Logan. Carter muttered, his eyes flicking toward the nearest guard. The lock clicked softly, and Logan eased the door open just wide enough for them to slip inside. The interior of the warehouse was cavernous, filled with towering crates and heavy machinery. Overhead lights flickered, casting long, jittery shadows across the cold concrete floor. In the distance, Caleb Viper Kane's sharp voice cut through the ambient noise. Keep those crates moving. We've got another shipment hitting the road in 2 hours. And if even one box goes missing, he's gonna hear about it. The men moved like ants under Kane's orders, hauling crates marked with military-grade insignias into waiting trucks. Some of the boxes were stamped with symbols that Logan recognized: government contractors, restricted exports, and equipment tags usually reserved for classified operations. Carter exhaled slowly. This isn't just small-time trafficking, Logan. This is high-level government assets. Black market transfers. Someone way up the food chain is pulling these strings. Logan's jaw tightened as he scanned the operation. A makeshift office had been set up on a raised platform overlooking the main floor. Inside, a man in a crisp suit and a military haircut stood next to Kane, gesturing toward a tablet displaying logistical data. That's our guy, Logan said, pointing subtly. Kane's just the face. That one's calling the shots. Carter squinted through the shadows. Whoever he is, he's not low-level. Look at his posture, his control. That's ex-military, maybe even active. Logan nodded grimly. We need to hear what they're saying. They crept closer, weaving through the stacks of crates and staying low to avoid detection. Logan slipped a small recording device from his vest and activated it. As they approached the edge of the raised platform, snippets of conversation drifted down. Final shipment goes out tomorrow night. After that, Eagle's Rest becomes irrelevant. The general wants this wrapped up cleanly, no loose ends. Kane's voice followed, sharp and agitated. And what about Hayes? The guy's more resourceful than we thought. He's not gonna let this slide. The suited man, clearly someone with authority, snapped his head toward Kane. That's your problem. Kane. You were supposed to handle Hayes quietly. And instead, you've turned him into a liability. The general doesn't tolerate liabilities. Logan's stomach tightened at the mention of a general. Whoever was behind this wasn't some rogue mercenary, this was organized, funded, and protected. Carter's voice was barely a whisper. We need to get out of here with that recording. This changes everything. But before they could move, one of the patrolling guards turned a corner and spotted them. His flashlight beam froze on Logan's face. Hey! Intruders! The silence shattered as the guard fired off a burst from his rifle. Logan and Carter dove for cover. Bullets ricocheting off steel crates and sending shards of wood flying. Move! Logan barked, returning fire as they dashed toward the exit. The warehouse erupted into chaos. Kane's men scrambled, shouting orders and firing blindly into the shadows. The suited man disappeared into a side door, his tablet clutched tightly under his arm. Logan and Carter reached the southern exit, Carter kicking the door open as Logan fired one last covering shot behind them. They tumbled outside, their boots skidding on gravel as they sprinted toward the cover of nearby trees. Keep moving! Carter shouted as bullets tore through the night air. Logan's radio crackled to life. It was Sheriff Neil Hargrove. Logan! We heard shots. You need an evac? No! Logan snapped back, his breath ragged. Stay clear. Sheriff. We can't lead them back to town. Just keep the perimeter tight and watch the roads. The two men kept running until the gunfire faded behind them, swallowed by the vast, empty fields surrounding the warehouse. When they finally stopped, both men were breathing hard, their faces streaked with sweat and grime. Logan reached into his vest and pulled out the tiny recording device. He held it up to Carter, his expression grim. We've got them talking. Names, shipment schedules, and a general calling the shots. This is the proof we needed. Carter nodded slowly, his sharp eyes scanning the horizon. But it's not over. Logan. They're gonna come after us now. And whoever this general is, he's not gonna let us walk away with this intel. Logan pocketed the recorder and glanced back toward the distant glow of the warehouse lights. No, he won't. But now we know his name, and that gives us an edge. The two men melted into the night, the weight of their discovery pressing heavy on their shoulders. Somewhere far above them, in an office lined with maps and strategy reports, a shadowy figure was already planning their next move. The hunt was far from over. The faint glow of dawn crept through the thin branches of the trees as Logan Hayes crouched behind his surveillance station, the dim light from the monitors illuminating his worn face. Carter Owens stood nearby, arms crossed, his sharp eyes locked onto the live feeds showing multiple SUVs speeding down narrow forest roads toward their location. They found us, Logan muttered, his voice tight with tension. Carter leaned closer, examining the approaching convoy on the screens. Those aren't amateurs. Logan. Look at their formation, tight, controlled. Whoever sent them isn't taking chances this time. Logan's fingers danced over the keyboard, pulling up additional feeds from hidden cameras scattered across the wooded perimeter. The men exiting the vehicles moved with precision, dark tactical gear, military-grade rifles, and helmets equipped with night vision goggles. They're contractors, Logan said grimly. Not Kane's gang. These guys are ex-military, maybe even still active. Carter grunted. We need to move now. They'll sweep this place clean if they get within 50 yards. Logan nodded and grabbed his rifle, slinging it over his shoulder. With practiced efficiency, he shut down the surveillance system, wiping any trace of their activity. Carter collected a duffel bag filled with spare ammunition, water, and medical supplies. Outside, the distant rumble of engines grew louder. Logan's gaze flicked toward the monitors one last time before he flipped the power switch, plunging the room into darkness. We're leaving, Logan said, but not without leaving a few surprises behind. The two men moved quickly through the dense underbrush, their boots silent on the damp forest floor. Logan carried a small remote detonator in his hand, his thumb hovering over the trigger. Behind them, faint beams of flashlights cut through the mist, accompanied by sharp commands barked in clipped military tones. They had set a series of traps around the perimeter earlier, tripwires connected to small explosives and noisemakers meant to sow confusion and buy time. Carter glanced over his shoulder. They're spreading out. Standard search pattern. They'll find the station in 5 minutes. Tops. Logan adjusted the strap on his rifle. Then we make sure they don't like what they find. He pressed the detonator. A sharp pop split the air, followed by a burst of smoke and bright flashes from multiple directions. Shouts erupted in the distance as the contractors scrambled, their formation breaking apart amid the confusion. Move! Logan barked, and both men dashed through the undergrowth, weaving between trees and hopping over exposed roots. Behind them, the contractors regrouped quickly, faster than Logan had anticipated. The distant crack of suppressed gunfire echoed through the trees, bullets whipping past and splintering bark. Logan slid behind a large fallen tree, raising his rifle and scanning the forest line. Through the scope, he spotted two figures moving cautiously toward them, their rifles raised and their postures professional. He exhaled slowly, squeezed the trigger, and one of the contractors dropped silently. Carter fired at the second one, hitting him in the shoulder and sending him spinning to the ground. But there was no time to celebrate. More contractors were closing in, their flashlights bobbing through the dark woods. Logan and Carter kept moving, darting through the trees, their breathing controlled despite the adrenaline pumping through their veins. They had rehearsed these scenarios before. Years of field experience and countless missions had burned survival tactics into their muscle memory. As they neared a rocky incline, Carter paused, scanning the area ahead. We can funnel them through that choke point up there, he said, pointing toward a narrow section of the ridge. We'll have the high ground. Logan nodded, and they climbed swiftly, their boots scraping against loose rocks. When they reached the top, they dropped to their knees, rifles ready. Below, the contractors moved cautiously into the natural bottleneck. Their flashlights illuminated the narrow path, and Logan counted at least 8 figures moving in tandem. Wait for my signal, Logan whispered. The contractors drew closer, their boots crunching over gravel. When they were halfway through the choke point, Logan gave a sharp nod. Both men opened fire. The confined space amplified the sound of gunfire, and the contractors had nowhere to run. 2 went down instantly, while the others scrambled for cover, firing blindly upward. Logan and Carter stayed low, picking their targets carefully. But the contractors were adapting, regrouping faster than expected. We can't hold this spot, Carter said, reloading his rifle. They'll flank us in 2 minutes. Logan scanned the ridge and spotted a narrow trail leading further into the woods. We fall back. Now. The 2 men moved again, disappearing into the trees just as grenades exploded behind them, sending dirt and splintered wood into the air. After nearly 20 minutes of running, Logan and Carter finally stopped to catch their breath. They had created enough distance to escape the immediate danger. But the forest around them still felt hostile, every shadow, every rustle of leaves, a potential threat. Carter leaned against a tree, wiping sweat from his brow. They're relentless. Logan. Whoever hired them isn't sparing any expense. Logan nodded, his jaw set in a hard line. They're not just here to capture us, they're here to eliminate us. This isn't about silencing us anymore. It's about sending a message. For a moment, neither man spoke. The forest was quiet again. But it was an uneasy silence. Logan reached for his radio, his voice low but firm. "Sheriff Hargrove. We've got contractors sweeping the forest. Highly trained. Heavily armed. Keep your men out of these woods. We'll handle this." The sheriff's voice crackled through the speaker. "Copy that. Logan. We'll lock down the roads and stay clear. You two stay alive." Logan turned to Carter, his expression grim. "We can't run forever. It's time we stop playing defense." Carter nodded, his hand tightening on his rifle. "Then let's set the stage and end this on our terms." Together, they disappeared deeper into the forest, their shadows merging with the dark as they prepared for the next encounter. The storm wasn't letting up. But Logan and Carter were far from finished. The cold night air clung to Logan Hayes' skin as he crouched low behind a moss-covered boulder. The faint glow of flashlights and distant chatter of the contractors echoed through the dark forest. Beside him, Carter Owens adjusted the strap on his rifle, his eyes sharp and unyielding. "They're still searching," Carter muttered. "But they're spreading out too thin. They're confident, they think they've got us pinned." Logan's expression was grim as he studied the faint outlines of their pursuers in the distance. "Arrogance makes them predictable. We'll use that." The two men exchanged a brief nod before slipping further into the trees, their movements silent as shadows. Logan led the way, weaving through the dense underbrush with the quiet efficiency of a predator stalking prey. Behind them, the distant sound of contractors barking orders grew fainter. Logan paused at a small clearing and motioned for Carter to stop. He gestured to an old hunting trail veering downhill. "This path leads to the creek bed. If we set up there, we can funnel them in and control their approach." Carter gave a curt nod. "Works for me. But if they realize it's a trap, we'll have nowhere to fall back to." Logan's jaw tightened. "Then we make sure they don't realize it until it's too late." 15 minutes later, Logan and Carter were positioned along the rocky edge of the creek bed. The shallow stream gurgled faintly as water flowed over smooth stones, masking the faint sounds of their breathing. Logan had set up a small line of tripwire explosives along the edge of the path leading into the clearing, nothing catastrophic, but enough to disorient and delay. From their position, they could see the faint glow of flashlights approaching. The contractors moved in pairs, their rifles sweeping methodically through the brush. Logan raised a hand, signaling Carter to stay low. The first pair stepped into the clearing, their boots crunching against loose gravel. They paused, scanning their surroundings. One of them muttered something into his radio, but Logan couldn't make out the words. A moment later, another pair entered, then another. Logan's breath was steady as he waited. Timing was everything. When the fourth pair stepped into the clearing, one of them caught his boot on the thin tripwire stretched low across the ground. The small explosive went off with a sharp pop, sending up a blinding flash and a burst of smoke. The contractors shouted in surprise, stumbling back as confusion rippled through their formation. "Now!" Logan barked. Gunfire erupted as Logan and Carter opened fire from their elevated position. Logan's rifle kicked against his shoulder as he dropped one contractor. Then another. Carter's precise shots cut down two more. The remaining operatives scrambled for cover, their flashlights darting wildly across the clearing as they tried to locate the source of the attack. Logan fired again, hitting a man attempting to flank their position. Carter reloaded with swift precision, his rifle barking short. Controlled bursts. But the contractors weren't amateurs, they adapted quickly. A group of three broke away from the clearing, attempting to circle around Logan and Carter's position. They're flanking left, Carter called out, his voice sharp. Logan swung his rifle to the left, spotting the movement just in time. He squeezed the trigger, and one of the men fell, tumbling into the creek with a splash. Carter took out another, but the third disappeared into the shadows. Then came the sound Logan had been dreading, the distant crackle of a radio followed by a sharp voice barking orders. Team 2. Fall back. Regroup at the ridge. The remaining contractors began to pull back, their flashlights retreating into the dark forest like fireflies vanishing into the night. Logan let out a slow breath, his rifle still raised, scanning for any stragglers. Carter lowered his weapon, his voice tight. They're pulling out. That's not a retreat, it's a regroup. They'll be back. And next time they'll bring more. Logan nodded grimly. They know we're not easy targets now. But they also know we're running out of places to hide. The two men descended from their position, carefully making their way back to the creek bed. Logan checked the bodies of the fallen contractors, searching for anything useful, maps, communication devices, or identifying insignias. On one of the dead operatives, Logan found a laminated card tucked into a vest pocket. It had a single word printed on it, Sentinel. Below the word was a barcode and a series of numbers. Carter leaned over his shoulder. Sentinel. Sounds like a code name or an organization. Logan turned the card over in his gloved hand, his brow furrowed. This isn't gang-related. This is something much larger. These men aren't just mercenaries, they're part of something organized. Something sanctioned. The distant sound of an approaching helicopter's blades began to cut through the silence. Both men froze, their eyes snapping upward toward the faint glimmer of a searchlight slicing through the tree canopy. We've been spotted, Carter said, his voice low. Logan shoved the card into his pocket. We move. Now. The two men darted back into the dense underbrush, the faint light of the helicopter's spotlight chasing their shadows across the forest floor. The game had changed. Whoever Sentinel was, they were done playing subtle. And Logan knew one thing for certain, the storm was only growing darker. The distant hum of helicopter blades echoed through the cold night air, growing louder with each passing second. Logan Hayes and Carter Owens moved swiftly through the dense forest, weaving between trees and ducking under low-hanging branches. The faint glow of the searchlight swept across the forest floor, chasing their shadows. They've brought in air support, Carter muttered, his voice tight with urgency. Logan glanced upward as the helicopter's spotlight briefly illuminated their path. We can't outrun that light if they get a clear shot at us. We need cover, thick cover. Up ahead, Logan spotted a rocky outcrop that led to a narrow cave opening partially hidden by tangled roots and moss. Without hesitation, he pointed to it. There. The two men sprinted toward the opening, their boots crunching against loose gravel and leaves. Carter slid into the cave first, followed closely by Logan. The two men pressed themselves against the damp rock walls, their breaths shallow as the helicopter's light passed overhead. For several tense moments, the spotlight lingered nearby, its bright beam casting eerie shapes across the uneven walls of the cave. Then, slowly, it drifted away. Carter exhaled a shaky breath. We bought ourselves a few minutes. But they're not done hunting us. Logan nodded, pulling the laminated Sentinel card from his vest pocket. The single word, accompanied by the barcode and serial numbers, seemed heavier now in the faint glow of Carter's flashlight. This wasn't a random hit, Logan said. They know exactly who we are. And they came prepared. Whoever Sentinel is. They've got resources, and they're not afraid to use them. Carter leaned closer, his brow furrowed as he studied the card. This barcode looks like it's tied to an asset. Maybe equipment, personnel, or something else. If we could scan it. Logan's lips pressed into a thin line. We're not going to find answers out here. We need access to a secure system, somewhere we can decode this without Sentinel tracking us. The two men waited until the faint sound of the helicopter faded completely before emerging cautiously from the cave. The forest was eerily quiet now, as though holding its breath in anticipation. Logan led the way, moving through the underbrush with the instincts of a seasoned predator. Carter followed, his rifle held at the ready. After an hour of careful navigation, they reached the edge of the woods overlooking a stretch of empty road. There's an old service tunnel near Route 17, Logan said. It runs under the highway and leads to the outskirts of Eagle's Rest. If we can reach it, we'll have a chance to regroup and plan our next move. Carter scanned the road with sharp eyes. And if they've got roadblocks waiting for us? Logan's mouth tightened into a grim line. Then we improvise. They descended carefully, crossing the road in quick bursts under the cover of darkness. Logan took the lead, guiding Carter down an overgrown embankment until they reached the rusted entrance of an old drainage tunnel. Water trickled faintly in the darkness, and the smell of mildew filled the air. Doesn't look like anyone's been down here in years, Carter said quietly. That's what I'm counting on, Logan replied. They moved cautiously through the tunnel, their footsteps echoing faintly against the wet stone walls. Logan's flashlight cut a narrow beam through the pitch-black darkness, illuminating faded graffiti and rusted metal pipes. After what felt like hours, the tunnel finally opened up into an abandoned maintenance station on the outskirts of Eagle's Rest. The small structure was barely more than a shack, its windows cracked and its door hanging loose on rusted hinges. Logan swept the room with his flashlight before motioning Carter inside. The space was cramped and smelled of decay, but it was secure enough for now. Carter dropped his gear onto an overturned crate and let out a long breath. We've got maybe 6 hours before they pick up our trail again. Less if they have drones or satellite support. Logan pulled out his encrypted tablet and set it on a makeshift table. The device powered on with a faint hum, and he began typing quickly. We need to decode this card. If Sentinel is tied to something bigger, we have to know what it is before we make our next move. Carter paced the room, glancing occasionally out of the cracked window. Logan, you know what this feels like? Like we're scratching at the surface of something massive, something we might not be able to stop. Logan didn't look up from the screen. We've come too far to turn back now. Carter, if we stop, this town, and everyone in it, will be swallowed whole by whatever Sentinel is planning. The tablet beeped softly, and Logan's screen filled with a string of decoded text and coordinates. Carter leaned over, reading aloud. Central Operations Hub. Coordinates. This isn't local, Logan. This is a regional command center. Logan's eyes narrowed as he studied the data. This is where the real power sits. Kane. The contractors, they're all just pieces on a chessboard. If we want to stop this, we need to go straight to the source. Carter's voice was low but firm. That's a one-way trip. Logan. You know that, right? Logan met his gaze, his expression steely. Then we make it count, Outside, the faintest hint of dawn began to creep over the horizon, bathing the edges of the shack in pale light. For a brief moment, the world seemed still, but both men knew better. The storm was far from over, and the shadow of Sentinel loomed larger than ever. The chill of the night clung to Logan Hayes' skin as he and Carter Owens crouched behind a tangle of thorny bushes overlooking the sprawling industrial complex. The faint hum of generators and the sharp bark of distant orders echoed through the night air. Floodlights mounted on tall poles cut jagged beams across the gravel yard, illuminating shipping containers stacked like makeshift fortresses. Logan adjusted his binoculars, scanning the facility's perimeter. It wasn't just heavily guarded, it was fortified. Contractors in matching tactical gear patrolled in pairs, their rifles slung across their chests, their movements precise and methodical. "They've got overlapping patrols," Logan said, his voice low. "And those guards aren't just muscle, they're trained operatives." Carter grunted, his sharp eyes following the same patterns Logan had observed. "Whoever's behind this isn't leaving anything to chance. We'll have a hell of a time getting in, let alone getting out." Logan lowered the binoculars and turned to Carter. "That building there, east side. 3 stories. It's the command hub. Look at the floodlight coverage and the way those patrols cluster around it. Whoever's in charge is in there." Carter nodded. "We need to get inside without triggering an alarm. Once we find out who's running this circus, we'll have answers." The 2 men crept down from their vantage point, using the terrain to mask their approach. The smell of oil and industrial waste grew stronger as they neared the fence line. Logan reached into his pack and pulled out a pair of wire cutters, slicing through the thick chain-link fence with practiced efficiency. They slipped through the opening and flattened themselves against the shadows of a nearby container. Carter scanned the open yard with a small, handheld thermal scope. 2 guards. Northeast. Moving away from us. Another pair near the trucks on the south side. Logan tapped Carter's shoulder, and the 2 moved like phantoms through the maze of steel crates and parked trucks. Every step was deliberate, every breath measured. They reached the side of the command building without incident, pressing their backs against the cold concrete wall. Logan pointed upward to a maintenance ladder bolted to the side of the building. "We'll go up. Roof access might give us a way in without tripping any alarms." Carter slung his rifle across his back and began climbing, his boots barely making a sound against the metal rungs. Logan followed closely behind, the weight of his pack and rifle making each step feel heavier. At the top, they found a maintenance hatch partially concealed by HVAC vents. Logan unscrewed the bolts with a small tool from his vest, carefully lifting the hatch. Cool air rushed upward from the dark interior below. They dropped into the building one after the other, landing softly on a grated metal walkway overlooking the command center below. The room was a hive of activity. Large monitors displayed maps, shipping schedules, and lines of encrypted communication. Contractors moved between stations, relaying information and coordinating logistics. In the center of it all stood Caleb Viper Kane, barking orders while clutching a tablet in one hand. But Kane wasn't alone. Standing opposite him was a tall man in a pressed military uniform, his hair cut short, his posture rigid. His presence commanded respect and fear. His voice carried through the room with sharp authority. "This operation must remain on schedule. Kane, the shipment cannot be delayed any further. Our client expects results, and failure is not an option." Logan's stomach tightened. This wasn't just another criminal enterprise, this was organized, sanctioned, and protected. "Understood, sir," Kane said, his usual arrogance tempered in the man's presence. The man in uniform continued, his voice low but firm. "We've been lenient so far, But your inability to deal with haze has cost us time and resources. If this persists, I will handle it personally." Kane swallowed hard and nodded. Carter leaned close to Logan, his voice barely a whisper. "That's our guy. That's the one pulling the strings." Logan nodded, his expression hard. "He's not just another player. This guy's a professional, a soldier. Maybe higher up the chain." The two men watched as Kane and the uniformed officer continued their discussion. Logan activated a small recording device, capturing every word. The officer turned sharply and began walking toward a side office flanked by two guards. Kane stayed behind, barking fresh orders to his men. Logan's voice was steady. "We need to follow him. That office might have intel we can use, names, shipment details, anything." Carter glanced down at the guards. "We'll have to move fast. Once he realizes we're here, we'll have the whole place on our backs." Logan scanned the area below, identifying a path that would minimize exposure. "On my mark. We move." The two men descended a narrow staircase at the side of the catwalk, slipping into the shadows of the command center. Guards moved nearby, their conversations blending into the background noise of keyboard clicks and distant radio chatter. Logan signaled Carter, and they darted across an open section of the floor, their boots silent against the polished concrete. They reached the hallway leading to the side office just as the guards stationed outside stepped away to respond to a radio call. Logan pushed open the door, and the two men slipped inside. The office was small, dominated by a large metal desk piled with documents, maps, and a sleek laptop displaying encrypted data streams. Logan quickly began photographing documents with his tablet while Carter kept watch by the door. Suddenly, the faint crackle of a radio broke the silence. "Perimeter sweep complete. Intrusion detected. Lock down the facility. Repeat, lock down the facility." Logan froze, his eyes meeting Carter's. Their window of escape was rapidly closing. "We've been made," Carter said, his voice tense. Logan pocketed the tablet and drew his sidearm. "Then we fight our way out." Outside the door, heavy boots thundered down the hallway, and the sound of rifles being cocked echoed ominously. The trap had been set, and now the hunters had become the hunted. The sharp echo of boots pounding against concrete reverberated through the narrow hallway as Logan Hayes and Carter Owens braced themselves inside the small, dimly lit office. The flicker of a lone fluorescent light overhead cast jittery shadows on the walls, while the faint hum of distant machinery filled the oppressive silence. Logan pressed his back against a filing cabinet, his sidearm raised, eyes locked on the door. Carter crouched low by the corner, rifle steady, his finger hovering just above the trigger. "They're sealing the exits," Carter said, his voice low but sharp. "We won't make it out the way we came in." Logan's jaw tightened as he glanced around the cramped space. A laptop sat open on the desk, data still streaming across the screen, coordinates, manifests, encrypted communication logs. It was invaluable intel. But they were out of time. "We'll worry about that later," Logan said. "Right now, we survive." The faint crackle of a radio carried through the thin walls, followed by a gruff voice barking orders. "Team Delta, converge on the command office. Do not let them escape. Authorization for lethal force confirmed." Carter exhaled sharply. "They've got orders to kill us on sight. No more games." "Logan." Before Logan could respond, the door handle rattled violently, followed by the deafening sound of gunfire as bullets tore through the thin metal. Paperwork exploded into the air. Shards of glass rained down, and the fluorescent light above sparked before plunging the room into flickering semi-darkness. Logan dropped low, returning fire through the narrow gap of the shattered doorframe. Carter followed, his rifle barking in controlled bursts. "Move!" Logan shouted, gesturing toward a ventilation duct near the ceiling. Carter slung his rifle over his shoulder and climbed onto the desk, pulling himself into the narrow vent. Logan fired one last burst before holstering his weapon and leaping up after Carter. Below, the door finally gave way, and Tactical Boots stormed into the office just as Logan disappeared into the vent. The ventilation shaft was suffocatingly narrow, every movement echoing through the metal walls. Logan led the way, his sidearm clenched tightly in his right hand, while Carter followed close behind, his breathing controlled despite the claustrophobic space. "They'll know we're in here," Carter muttered. "They'll be tracking heat signatures." Logan's voice was low and steady. "We just need to get above them. The higher we go, the harder we are to pin down." They crawled in silence, every creak of metal making their nerves snap taut. Below them, faint voices carried upward, contractors coordinating movements, checking rooms, clearing sectors. After several tense minutes, Logan spotted a grated opening ahead. He paused, peering through the narrow slats. Below was an expansive operations floor bustling with activity. Contractors moved in formation. Crates were being loaded into unmarked trucks, and a large digital map flickered across an overhead screen. In the center of the floor stood the man they had seen earlier, the general. His uniform was pristine, and his demeanor radiated an aura of absolute authority. He was surrounded by armed guards, his cold gaze sweeping the operations center. Carter whispered from behind, "We can't take him here. Too many men. Too many guns." Logan's jaw tightened as he scanned the room below. "We're not here to fight. We're here to see." He carefully activated the camera on his tablet, angling it through the grate to capture footage of the general and the high-value activity below. The general's voice cut through the noise of the floor. "We're moving into final phase preparation. The shipment will be airborne in 4 hours. Make sure every piece of equipment is accounted for. Any loose ends," he paused, his gaze hardening. "Eliminate them." Logan's stomach churned. Whatever they were planning, it was happening soon. Carter leaned in. "We've got what we need." "Logan. Time to go." Logan hesitated for a brief moment before nodding. "Let's move." They continued crawling through the ventilation shaft, putting as much distance as they could between themselves and the command center. Sweat dripped down their faces, their muscles aching from the cramped quarters. The shaft eventually led them to another maintenance room, a dusty space filled with rusted tools, storage crates, and an emergency exit hatch bolted shut. Logan dropped down first, followed by Carter. Both men took a moment to catch their breath. Carter moved to the hatch, inspecting the bolts. "It's locked from the outside. We'll need to blast it open." Logan pulled a small breaching charge from his pack and attached it to the hatch. "Stand back." With a muffled thump, the charge blew the bolts apart, and the hatch creaked open. Cold night air flooded the room as Logan climbed through, followed by Carter. They emerged into an overgrown lot behind the facility, shielded by stacks of rusting shipping containers. The distant glow of the floodlights was partially obscured by fog rolling in from the surrounding hills. "We're clear, for now," Carter said, scanning the area. Logan pulled out his tablet, reviewing the footage they had captured. The general's face, his commands, the shipment schedule, it was all there. "This is enough to blow the lid off whatever they're planning," Logan said, his voice steady. "But we're not done yet." Carter adjusted his rifle strap. "They'll know we've escaped, and they'll come hunting. This isn't over." Logan tucked the tablet securely into his vest pocket. We'll regroup at the farm. Go through this data. And plan our next move. Whatever happens next. We're bringing this into the light. The two men vanished into the shadows of the foggy night, leaving the fortified complex behind them. High above, the faint hum of another helicopter grew louder, its searchlight cutting through the mist like a knife. The storm wasn't over, it was only getting started. The pale morning light stretched thin over Eagle's Rest, painting the town in muted shades of gray. The silence was heavy, almost suffocating, broken only by the occasional bark of a dog or the creak of a swinging sign above a boarded-up storefront. Logan Hayes leaned against his truck, his sharp eyes scanning the empty main street. Beside him, Carter Owens checked his rifle with practiced efficiency, the faint clink of metal breaking the stillness. Sheriff Neil Hargrove approached, his boots crunching against gravel. His face was pale, drawn with exhaustion and the weight of looming catastrophe. They'll come through the main road first, Neil said, his voice low but steady. Then they'll hit us from the side streets. They'll box us in before we even know what's happening. Logan nodded, his jaw tight. That's what I'd do. They'll want to hit us hard and fast. Keep us off balance. Behind them, a handful of volunteers and deputies worked frantically, setting up makeshift barricades from old cars, dumpsters, and stacks of sandbags. The townsfolk had been moved to the old church on the hill, one of the most defensible points in Eagle's Rest. Carter spoke up, his voice gruff. We can hold them, but not for long. If they've got numbers and heavy equipment, this town's going to be reduced to rubble. Neil crossed his arms, glancing between the two men. Then we make every second count. We hold the line until Logan gets that intel out. If they want Eagle's Rest, they'll have to bleed for it. Logan's hand went instinctively to the encrypted tablet secured inside his vest. The data they had stolen from the warehouse, the shipment details, the recordings. The face of the general was the only card they had left to play. He turned to the sheriff. You get your deputies in place. Carter and I will cover the perimeter. When the first wave hits, we'll slow them down. Buy you time. Neil nodded and turned back toward the station, barking orders to his men. The hours ticked by with agonizing slowness as the sun climbed higher. Logan and Carter moved quietly through the outskirts of town, planting improvised explosives along choke points and marking sniper positions on rooftops. They stopped near an abandoned gas station on the east side of town. Carter scanned the tree line with a pair of binoculars, his expression darkening. Movement, he said quietly. 2 SUVs. Blacked out windows. They're scouting ahead. Logan pulled out his rifle and dropped into a crouch, bracing against a broken-down gas pump. Through his scope, he could see the SUVs creeping along the narrow road, their engines barely audible. They're testing us, Logan said softly, seeing if we'll react. We hold fire. The SUVs stopped briefly at an intersection before turning around and disappearing back into the tree line. Carter exhaled, lowering his binoculars. They'll hit us hard tonight. That was just the opening act. Logan's radio crackled to life. Neil's voice came through, low and tense. Logan. They've started blocking roads leading out of town. They're locking us in. Logan pressed the transmit button. Understood. Sheriff. Get everyone ready. The clock's ticking. By late afternoon, the sun hung low, casting long shadows over Eagle's Rest. The tension was palpable as the final preparations were made. Volunteers stood shoulder to shoulder with deputies, rifles clutched tightly in nervous hands. Atop the sheriff's station, Logan adjusted his scope, scanning the horizon. Carter knelt nearby, his rifle propped against the edge of the rooftop. The radio crackled again. Neil's voice came through. "Logan. Carter. We've got movement on the North Road. Multiple vehicles. Armed personnel. This is it." Logan exhaled slowly, steadying his breathing. "Copy that. Sheriff. Everyone hold your ground." The distant hum of engines grew louder, rumbling through the empty streets like distant thunder. Headlights pierced the gathering dusk as a convoy of black SUVs and armored trucks rolled into view. Contractors in tactical gear spilled out of the vehicles, moving with sharp precision. Logan's finger rested lightly on the trigger of his rifle. "They're spreading out. Standard breach and clear formation. They'll sweep the town block by block." Carter's voice was steady but firm. "We make every shot count. Logan. No second chances." From their elevated position, the two men watched as the contractors advanced cautiously down Main Street. A loudspeaker crackled to life from one of the armored trucks. "Attention. Residents of Eagles Rest. Lay down your arms and surrender immediately. Resistance will be met with deadly force." No one moved. No one spoke. Then, from one of the side alleys, a shot rang out. A contractor dropped to the ground, and chaos erupted. Gunfire exploded across Main Street as volunteers and deputies opened fire from windows, rooftops, and behind barricades. The contractors returned fire with ruthless efficiency, their suppressors turning loud bursts into sharp, mechanical snaps. Logan fired, his rifle bucking against his shoulder. One contractor crumpled. Another staggered back, clutching his chest. Carter's rifle cracked again and again, each shot deliberate and precise. Below, Sheriff Neil Hargrove moved between positions, shouting orders and rallying his men. The volunteers held their ground, but the contractors were relentless, pushing forward inch by inch. "Logan." Neil's voice came through the radio. "They're bringing up heavy weapons. We can't hold this line much longer." Logan's heart pounded in his chest as he surveyed the battlefield. Fires had broken out along Main Street, and smoke billowed into the evening sky. He pressed the radio button. "Hold as long as you can. Sheriff. We'll buy you every second we can." Carter turned to Logan, his face streaked with sweat and soot. "Logan. We're running out of time. If we don't get that intel out." Logan nodded grimly, clutching the encrypted tablet in his vest. "They're coming, Carter. And we're not done yet." As the night closed in around them and the sounds of gunfire echoed through the streets of Eagles Rest, Logan Hayes knew one thing for certain. The storm had arrived. Night had fallen over Eagles Rest, but the town was anything but quiet. The once tranquil streets were now a war zone, lit by the flickering glow of fires and the sharp muzzle flashes of gunfire. Smoke hung heavy in the air, carrying the acrid scent of burning debris and cordite. Logan Hayes crouched behind a makeshift barricade of overturned tables and sandbags, his rifle steady as he scanned the chaos unfolding in front of him. "Carter. Status." Logan barked into his radio, his voice barely cutting through the roar of nearby explosions. Carter Owen's voice crackled back. "We're holding at the southern barricade, but they're pressing hard. They've got armored vehicles pushing through." Logan gritted his teeth and fired off 2 quick shots, dropping an advancing contractor who had been attempting to flank their position. Across the street, Sheriff Neil Hargrove directed a group of deputies, his revolver barking with each pull of the trigger. "We can't hold this position forever. Logan!" Neil shouted across the street. "They're going to overrun us." Logan keyed his radio again. "Carter. Fall back to the church. Neil. Pull your men back. We're making our stand there. The radio crackled as both men confirmed the order. Logan signaled to the remaining volunteers behind the barricade. Fall back. Move. Cover each other. The group moved swiftly but carefully, weaving through debris and leaping over rubble as bullets snapped and whizzed past them. Logan stayed behind, covering their retreat with precise, controlled fire until the last man had crossed into the alley leading to the church. He sprinted after them, his boots pounding against cracked asphalt, his breath coming in sharp bursts. The old stone church stood atop a small hill, its steeple silhouetted against the smoke-filled sky. Candles flickered faintly behind stained glass windows, casting colored patterns onto the worn wooden pews inside. The building had been transformed into a last line of defense, barricades blocked the entrance, and volunteers armed with rifles peeked through gaps in the boarded-up windows. Logan burst through the heavy wooden doors, followed closely by Carter and Sheriff Neil. The tension in the air was palpable as frightened townsfolk huddled in corners, their whispers blending into a low hum of fear. Carter dropped his pack on a pew and immediately began reloading magazines. Logan. They'll be here soon. This hill gives us a vantage point, but it's only going to buy us time. Neil wiped sweat from his brow, his face smeared with soot and grime. We need an escape plan. Logan. If they breach the church, it's over. Logan removed the encrypted tablet from his vest and placed it on the altar. Its screen glowed faintly, lines of text and coordinates reflected in his weary eyes. Our priority is getting this intel out, Logan said firmly. If we fail, everything we've done means nothing. Carter. You'll cover the rear exit. Neil. Get your deputies ready to defend the main entrance. I'll buy us time from up top. The sheriff nodded grimly and turned to rally his men. Carter slung his rifle over his shoulder and disappeared toward the rear of the church. Logan climbed a narrow spiral staircase leading to the bell tower. The view from the top was haunting. Eagle's Rest lay sprawled below, its streets illuminated by scattered fires and the flickering headlights of armored vehicles crawling closer. Through his scope, Logan could see contractors advancing in coordinated waves. They were disciplined, methodical, and entirely unrelenting. Logan took a deep breath, steadied his rifle, and began to fire. The first few shots found their marks. Contractors dropped silently, their lifeless forms crumpling into the shadows. But the enemy adapted quickly, using smoke grenades and suppressive fire to obscure their advance. From below, the sound of shattering glass and splintering wood echoed up the bell tower. The contractors had reached the church. Logan keyed his radio. Carter! They're breaching the rear. Carter's voice came back, calm but strained. We're holding them off, but they've got shields and breaching charges. They'll break through soon. Downstairs, Neil and his deputies fired relentlessly as the main doors buckled under the force of a battering ram. Wood splintered and cracked with each impact. Logan fired one last shot from the bell tower before slinging his rifle and descending the narrow staircase 2 steps at a time. The main entrance gave way just as he hit the floor. Contractors poured into the church, their rifles spitting fire as Neil's deputies returned fire from behind overturned pews. Chaos erupted inside the sacred walls. Logan took cover behind a stone pillar, his sidearm drawn. Bullets chipped away at the ancient stone, sending shards flying into the air. Neil! Logan shouted over the cacophony. The sheriff was pinned behind a pew, his revolver empty. We can't hold. Logan! They're everywhere! Logan's radio crackled again. Carter's voice came through, ragged. Logan! They've breached the rear. We're falling back. Time slowed for Logan as he scanned the scene. The volunteers were overwhelmed. Neil was running out of ammunition, and the contractors were closing in from all sides. Logan gritted his teeth and made a split-second decision. "Everyone fall back to the tunnels," he bellowed. "Move now." Neil and the remaining deputies began retreating toward a concealed door at the rear of the church, leading to a network of old mining tunnels that ran beneath the town. Logan fired until his magazine was empty, then grabbed the encrypted tablet from the altar and sprinted toward the tunnel entrance. As the heavy wooden door slammed shut behind them, the muffled sound of gunfire and explosions continued to echo above. In the suffocating darkness of the tunnel, Logan leaned against the damp stone wall, clutching the tablet tightly. Carter's silhouette appeared beside him, his voice low. "We bought ourselves some time, Logan, but they're not stopping." Logan nodded, his face set in stone. "We'll keep moving. We have to. Because if we fail, this town, and everyone in it, won't survive what comes next." In the faint glow of their flashlights, the two men led the survivors deeper into the tunnels, leaving the burning remains of Eagle's Rest behind them. The siege wasn't over. The real battle was just beginning. The damp air of the tunnels clung to Logan Hayes' skin as he led the survivors deeper into the underground passageways. The faint glow of flashlight beams flickered across the uneven walls, casting long, ghostly shadows on the jagged stone. Behind him, Carter Owens kept pace, his rifle at the ready, while Sheriff Neil Hargrove guided the wounded and weary townsfolk through the darkness. Tunnels narrowing up ahead. Carter muttered, "If they've got drones or heat sensors, they'll find us before we reach the exit." Logan paused at a junction where two paths diverged. He studied the damp ground and the faint smell of oil lingering in the air. "This way," he said, pointing to the right-hand tunnel. "It should lead us to the old mining access point. From there, we'll reassess." The group moved cautiously, the only sounds the soft scuffle of boots on stone and the distant drip of water echoing somewhere far behind them. The weight of exhaustion pressed heavily on everyone's shoulders, but no one dared complain. Above ground, chaos reigned. Contractors swept the streets of Eagle's Rest, and fires still smoldered where homes and businesses had once stood. Sheriff Neil caught up to Logan, his voice low but firm. "Logan, we've bought ourselves some time, but it won't last. Those contractors are professionals, they'll figure out where we've gone." Logan gave a curt nod. "We just need to stay one step ahead. If we can get above ground near the ridge, we'll have a chance to regroup." Carter, trailing slightly behind, adjusted his rifle strap. "And if they're waiting for us topside?" Logan's eyes were hard as steel. "Then we fight our way through." The tunnel eventually widened into a cavernous chamber, the remains of an abandoned mining facility. Rusted tracks crisscrossed the floor, and old carts lay overturned, their wheels long since seized with rust. Wooden support beams creaked under the weight of the earth above, and faded warning signs hung crookedly on splintered posts. "We rest here for 10 minutes, Logan said, his voice carrying authority. "Carter, set up a perimeter. Neil, check on the wounded." Carter gave a sharp nod and disappeared into the shadows, moving with practiced efficiency. Neil knelt beside a young deputy clutching his bloodied arm and began to dress the wound with trembling hands. Logan walked to the edge of the chamber, pulling the encrypted tablet from his vest pocket. The faint glow of the screen illuminated his face as he scrolled through the intercepted data. After a moment, his expression hardened. Carter reappeared from the shadows. "Anything useful on there?" Logan's jaw clenched as he turned the screen toward Carter. "Coordinates. Communication logs. A schedule." Carter leaned in, squinting at the illuminated display. "That's an airstrip. Remote. isolated. And this is a timeline. They're preparing for something big. Logan nodded. The shipment is moving. Whatever they're planning, it's happening soon. Hours. Maybe less. Neil joined them, wiping sweat from his brow. So what's the play? Logan? We're battered, outnumbered, and running out of time. Logan's gaze remained fixed on the tablet. We don't need to stop their entire operation, we just need to stop that shipment from leaving. If we fail, this thing goes global, and no one will be able to stop it. Carter crossed his arms, his voice low and steady. So we hit the airstrip. Disable the plane. Sabotage the cargo. Whatever it takes. But we can't take everyone with us. Neil's face was pale, but his voice remained steady. I'll stay here with the wounded and whoever can't fight. You two go after that plane. Logan hesitated for a brief moment before nodding. We'll leave at nightfall. The cover of darkness will give us the best chance of getting close without being spotted. The hours passed slowly in the cavern. The survivors huddled together, sharing what little food and water remained. Carter sat near the edge of the chamber, inspecting his rifle while Logan reviewed their route to the airstrip. Neil approached Logan quietly, his voice low. You think we can pull this off? Logan looked up, his face carved from stone. It doesn't matter if we think we can. We have to. Neil nodded slowly. Just come back alive. Logan. This town needs you. Logan said nothing, but the weight of Neil's words settled heavily on his shoulders. When the last slivers of daylight had faded from the cracks above, Logan and Carter prepared to move. They checked their gear, adjusted their rifles, and secured the precious tablet containing the stolen data. Neil clasped Logan's shoulder. Good luck, both of you. Logan offered a faint nod before turning to Carter. Let's move. The two men disappeared into the darkness of an adjoining tunnel, their flashlights casting fleeting beams of light ahead of them. Above ground, far from the smoldering ruins of Eagle's Rest, a grand stage was being set. At a remote airstrip surrounded by towering floodlights and guarded by heavily armed operatives, sleek black SUVs arrived one after another. Wealthy investors, foreign officials, and shadowy power brokers stepped out into the cool night air, greeted with champagne and presentations of cutting-edge military equipment. On the runway, a massive cargo plane loomed, its engines idling with a low, ominous growl. The general stood at the center of it all, dressed in a sharp military uniform adorned with unmarked insignias. His steely gaze scanned the crowd, his posture radiating power and control. The world is watching, he said calmly to an aide standing nearby. And tonight, they'll see what true power looks like. Miles away, hidden in the shadows of the forest, Logan Hayes and Carter Owens pushed forward toward the airstrip. The fate of countless lives depended on what happened next. The clock was ticking, and failure was not an option. The night was heavy with tension as Logan Hayes and Carter Owens crouched on a rocky ridge overlooking the airstrip. Below them, the floodlit tarmac stretched out like a glowing scar in the darkness, flanked by hangars and armored vehicles. A massive cargo plane sat at the center of the chaos, engines humming, ready for takeoff. Around the aircraft, contractors in tactical gear moved with sharp precision, coordinating final preparations. Beyond them, clusters of foreign dignitaries and shadowy figures in tailored suits observed the scene, champagne glasses catching the cold artificial light. Carter adjusted his rifle scope, his breath fogging slightly in the cold night air. This isn't just a shipment, Logan. This is a sales pitch. They're showing off their operation to the highest bidders. Logan nodded. his sharp eyes scanning the field below. And if that plane takes off, we lose. Whatever's on board, whatever they're selling, it's going to end up in the worst possible hands. Carter shifted his position slightly. So, what's the plan? Because right now, it looks like we're two men staring down an entire private army. Logan pulled out a small map of the compound, illuminated faintly by his flashlight. We can't hit the plane directly. Too many eyes. Too many guns. But see those fuel trucks lined up near the hangar? Carter followed Logan's finger and let out a low whistle. You light one of those up, and the whole airstrip becomes a fireworks show. Exactly. Logan said. We create chaos. Buy ourselves a window. And make sure that plane never leaves the ground. Carter smirked faintly. Always the simple plans with you, Logan. Simple works. Logan replied. Let's move. They descended the ridge with the stealth of seasoned predators, staying low as they navigated through the rocky terrain. The closer they got to the airstrip, the louder the hum of the plane's engines grew, vibrating through the soles of their boots. Logan signaled for Carter to split off, pointing toward an elevated sniper's perch made of stacked shipping containers. Carter nodded, disappearing into the shadows. Logan continued forward, keeping to the blind spots between floodlights. He could hear the faint chatter of contractors nearby, their voices calm, professional. He reached the first fuel truck, crouched low behind its massive tires, and pulled a small pack of explosives from his vest. His fingers worked quickly, attaching the device to the underside of the fuel tank. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the chill. Over the radio, Carter's voice crackled in his ear. I'm in position. Logan. Got eyes on the plane and most of the guards. Your move. Logan's thumb hovered over the detonator. On my mark. Carter. Make your first shot count. In the VIP section of the airstrip, the general stood tall amidst a sea of expensive suits and polished boots. His uniform was immaculate, his posture rigid. Nearby, a slick businessman with a nervous smile raised his glass. This is impressive, the man said cautiously. But are you certain it's secure? Hayes is still out there. The general's sharp gaze turned to the businessman, silencing him instantly. Hayes is irrelevant. The demonstration will proceed, and this shipment will reach its destination. The general raised his hand, signaling to the crew. The cargo bay of the plane began to close, massive hydraulic doors hissing as they sealed the mysterious payload inside. But just as the final door began to lock into place, a sharp crack split the air. One of the contractors near the plane's wing dropped like a stone, blood pooling beneath him. The sound of Carter's rifle echoed faintly in the distance. Chaos erupted. Logan pressed the detonator. A deafening explosion split the night as the first fuel truck erupted into a fireball. Flame shot skyward, casting wild shadows across the tarmac. Contractors scattered, shouting orders into their radios. Smoke billowed across the airstrip, obscuring visibility. Carter's rifle barked again, and another guard crumpled. Logan sprinted forward, weaving through the chaos as bullets zipped past him. Contractors fired blindly into the smoke, their beams of light slicing through the haze. At the edge of the chaos, the general stood unmoving, his face illuminated by the inferno. His calm demeanor had cracked, his jaw tight as he barked orders into his earpiece. Secure the plane. Get it airborne, now! But the damage was done. Flames licked at the underbelly of the aircraft, and smoke began pouring from one of the engines. Logan emerged from the smoke, his rifle raised. He fired 3 quick shots, taking down 2 contractors guarding the rear of the plane. with the chaos around him. He reached a nearby control panel, his fingers flying across switches and buttons. The plane's systems flickered. Warning alarms blared from its cockpit as fuel pressure dropped and the hydraulics seized. Through the smoke, Carter's voice came over the radio. "Logan, more reinforcements are inbound. We've got maybe 2 minutes before they box us in." Logan gritted his teeth, slamming one final override into the control panel. Sparks flew, and the sound of the plane's engines began sputtering. "This bird isn't flying anywhere," Logan growled. He turned and bolted back into the shadows, his silhouette vanishing amidst the chaos. Above them, helicopters approached from the distance, their searchlights cutting through the smoke. Carter's voice crackled again. "Logan, we're out of time. We need to move." Logan's breath came in sharp bursts as he sprinted back toward the perimeter. The airstrip was ablaze. The plane grounded, and the general's perfect showcase lay in smoldering ruins. But Logan knew the fight wasn't over. Not yet. The inferno at the airstrip raged behind them as Logan Hayes and Carter Owens moved with calculated urgency through the maze of smoke and debris. The air was thick with the acrid smell of burning fuel, and the distant wail of alarms created a disorienting cacophony. Overhead, helicopter searchlights cut sharp white lines through the swirling haze, sweeping across the chaos below. "Logan, they're regrouping," Carter shouted over the roar of the fire. He paused just long enough to fire a controlled burst from his rifle, dropping an advancing contractor. Logan crouched behind a stack of metal crates, his tablet clutched tightly under one arm. "We've done enough damage for one night. That plane isn't going anywhere. But they'll still hunt us down," Carter replied, ejecting a spent magazine and slamming a fresh one into place. "We need to put distance between us and this mess, now." Logan nodded sharply. "Head for the service road. It's our best shot at getting out unnoticed." The two men sprinted across the edge of the tarmac, using the thick smoke and burning wreckage as cover. Bullets zipped past them, sparks flying where rounds struck metal. Somewhere in the distance, the general's enraged voice barked orders through a loudspeaker. "Secure the perimeter. Stop them at all costs." Logan didn't look back. Every muscle in his body screamed for relief. But he pushed forward, leading Carter toward the shadowed edges of the compound. At the northern perimeter of the airstrip, a chain-link fence stood partially obscured by overgrown bushes and discarded crates. Logan dropped to one knee, inspecting the barrier. "Wire's weak here," he said, pulling a combat knife from his belt and cutting swiftly through the links. "We can squeeze through." Carter kept watch, his rifle trained on the distant figures moving through the smoke. "Make it fast, Logan. They're closing in." Once the hole was wide enough, Logan slipped through first, landing softly on the other side. Carter followed, his rifle clearing the gap just before more distant gunfire cracked through the night. The two men moved quickly down a gravel service road, their boots crunching softly against the loose stones. The forest loomed ahead, a dark refuge compared to the burning chaos they were leaving behind. "We need to keep moving," Logan said, glancing over his shoulder. "They'll sweep the perimeter soon." But Carter slowed slightly, his hand gripping Logan's arm. "Logan, wait." From a nearby clearing, faint voices carried on the wind. Logan crouched low, signaling Carter to do the same. Together, they crept toward the sound, staying hidden among the thick underbrush. In the clearing, 3 figures stood illuminated by the glow of handheld flashlights. One was a contractor, rifle slung over his shoulder. The other 2 were high-ranking officials, men in expensive suits, their faces drawn and tense. The plane was supposed to leave 20 minutes ago, one of the suited men hissed. Do you have any idea what this delay is costing us? The contractor's voice was flat. Professional. The general has ordered a lockdown. Hayes and Owens sabotaged the operation. We're tracking them now. The second suited man spoke. His voice colder. Tell your general that failure is unacceptable. If he can't control 2 men, then we will. Logan exchanged a look with Carter. These weren't just middlemen, they were the real power players behind the operation. But taking them out here wouldn't stop the larger machine. We keep moving. Logan whispered. We've got what we need. They backed away slowly, slipping into the darkness of the trees without a sound. The forest swallowed them whole, the glow of the airstrip fading into the distance behind them. Logan led the way. His flashlight turned low, its narrow beam guiding them along an overgrown trail. After nearly an hour of silent movement, they reached a ridge overlooking the valley below. The distant lights of Eagle's Rest twinkled faintly in the far-off darkness. Carter dropped to a knee, catching his breath. Logan. We're clear, for now. But they'll be scouring every road, every path. Logan pulled the encrypted tablet from his vest and stared at the flickering screen. The data they had stolen, names, coordinates, shipment logs, could expose everything. This isn't over. Carter. Logan said quietly. Not by a long shot. Carter let out a weary breath. So what now? We can't go back to Eagle's Rest. Not yet. Logan's eyes remained locked on the tablet. We get this intel to someone who can act on it. Someone outside the general's influence. But we need to lay low first. Regroup. And plan our next move. The distant sound of helicopters drifted faintly through the night sky. Carter glanced upward, his expression somber. They're not giving up. They'll keep coming. Logan nodded. Then we'll be ready for them. The 2 men sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their mission pressing heavily on their shoulders. Below them, the remnants of the general's operation smoldered. But Logan knew the man himself wasn't finished. Somewhere in the chaos of the night, the general was already regrouping, already planning his next move. Logan and Carter rose to their feet and disappeared into the forest, their silhouettes fading into the black. The war wasn't over, it was just entering its most dangerous phase. The faint glow of dawn barely pierced through the thick canopy of trees as Logan Hayes and Carter Owens navigated the dense forest surrounding the general's compound. Their breaths came in steady puffs of mist in the cold morning air. And every step was measured, every movement calculated. The night's chaos still clung to them, the distant hum of helicopters, the acrid scent of smoke, and the persistent burn of exhaustion. But their mission was clear: bring an end to the general's operation, no matter the cost. Logan crouched low behind a moss-covered boulder, raising his binoculars to scan the compound below. It was a fortress, a sprawling network of concrete buildings surrounded by electrified fences, guard towers, and armored vehicles parked at strategic positions. Security's tight, Carter whispered, his voice barely audible over the rustling leaves. They're expecting us. They should be. Logan replied, lowering the binoculars. After what we pulled at the airstrip, they know we won't stop. Carter adjusted his rifle strap, his face grim. What's the play? Logan? We're 2 men against an entire compound. Logan unrolled a worn map he had tucked into his vest, pointing at a side access tunnel marked faintly in red ink. There's an old maintenance tunnel leading to the lower levels of the compound. It's not on their standard patrol routes, but it'll get us close to their operations room. Carter studied the map and then nodded. If we can breach that room and get control of their communications, We might be able to broadcast the data from the tablet to external networks. Logan's jaw tightened. That's the plan. But we have to move now, before they fully regroup. They moved swiftly through the underbrush, keeping to the shadows as the compound loomed larger with every step. Logan led the way, his rifle at the ready, while Carter followed close behind, scanning their flanks. The hum of distant machinery and occasional chatter from guards crackled through handheld radios somewhere nearby. When they reached the tunnel entrance, Logan knelt by the rusted metal grate partially hidden beneath a tangle of roots. With a quick tug, the grate came loose, and a foul-smelling draft of stale air hit them. "After you," Carter said dryly, wrinkling his nose. Logan smirked faintly before dropping into the tunnel. Carter followed, landing softly on the damp, uneven ground below. The air was thick with moisture, and the faint sound of dripping water echoed through the narrow passage. They moved in silence, their flashlights casting faint beams on the grimy concrete walls. After several tense minutes, they reached a junction where faint light filtered through a grate above them. Logan held up a fist, signaling Carter to stop. He climbed up carefully, peeking through the grate. Above, 2 guards stood by a security door, rifles slung casually over their shoulders. Logan dropped back down and whispered, "2 guards. We need to take them quietly." Carter nodded, pulling a combat knife from his belt. Logan drew his own blade, and together they climbed silently up to the grate. In a fluid motion, they pushed it aside and emerged behind the guards. The takedown was swift. Carter grabbed one guard in a chokehold, silencing him before he could make a sound, while Logan drove his knife into the second guard's side. Both bodies were lowered gently to the floor. Logan retrieved the guard's access card and swiped it across the reader by the security door. With a faint beep, the lock disengaged, and the heavy door slid open. The interior of the compound was sterile and brightly lit. The cold white fluorescent lights cast sharp shadows across polished steel floors and control panels blinking with activity. Logan and Carter moved quickly, sticking close to the walls and avoiding the larger, open spaces where cameras could spot them. Through a narrow window, they could see the compound's operations center below, a cavernous room filled with rows of monitors displaying live feeds, maps, and encrypted communications. Contractors and technicians moved in a synchronized dance, guided by a figure standing at the center of the chaos. The general. His sharp uniform was pristine despite the night's chaos, his posture rigid as he barked orders to subordinates. Logan's grip tightened around his rifle. "That's him," Carter muttered. "The puppet master himself." Logan nodded, his voice low and firm. "We need to access one of those consoles. If we can patch in the tablet, we can broadcast the evidence." But before they could move, the distant sound of boots echoed through the hallway behind them. "Patrol incoming," Carter hissed. Logan motioned toward a maintenance closet nearby. They slipped inside just as a squad of heavily armed contractors passed by, their radios crackling with sharp voices. "They're doubling patrols," Logan said. "They know something's wrong." Carter checked his rifle, his expression grim. "Then we'd better move fast." Logan led the way down a side corridor, keeping low as they approached a secondary control station overlooking the operations center. The station was unmanned, its screens displaying camera feeds and security statuses. Logan pulled the encrypted tablet from his vest and connected it to the console. Lines of code began streaming across the screen as the data upload commenced. "Carter, keep watch. This is going to take a minute." Carter took position by the door, his rifle aimed and ready. Logan's fingers flew over the keyboard, bypassing firewalls and routing the data through external servers. Progress bars crawled across the screen as files transferred, evidence of corruption. Illegal arms deals. In the faces of those responsible. But then, a warning flashed across the screen, unauthorized access detected. Logan's stomach dropped. They know we're here. Carter's voice was sharp. Logan. We've got movement. They're coming. Logan clenched his jaw. His eyes locked on the final progress bar inching toward completion. Gunfire erupted outside the door. Carter firing controlled bursts as boots thundered closer. Almost there. Logan shouted. The screen flashed, data upload complete. Logan yanked the tablet free, slinging it into his vest. We're done. Move. Carter pulled back as bullets slammed into the walls around them. The two men dashed down the corridor. Alarms blaring and red warning lights flashing across the compound. The final confrontation was no longer avoidable. The general was waiting. The compound's alarms howled, their piercing wails reverberating through the cold steel corridors. Red warning lights painted the walls in streaks of crimson as Logan Hayes and Carter Owens sprinted down the narrow hallway, their boots pounding against the metal floor. They're closing in. Carter shouted over the blaring sirens, his rifle aimed toward the corridor behind them. Logan's face was set in stone, his encrypted tablet clutched tightly under one arm. We can't let them cut us off from the exit. Keep moving. Behind them, the sharp echoes of boots and rapid gunfire grew louder. Contractors were in pursuit, their shadows flickering against the strobing emergency lights. Logan slammed his shoulder into a side door, bursting into a large storage bay filled with crates of weapons and ammunition. Carter followed, slamming the door shut and locking it behind him. Won't hold them for long, Carter said, glancing at the thin metal hinges. Logan scanned the room, his sharp eyes catching a ventilation shaft near the ceiling. Up there. It might lead us closer to the operations floor. Carter nodded, and together they dragged a crate beneath the shaft. Logan hoisted himself up first, his boots scraping against the metal as he climbed into the narrow passageway. Carter followed, pulling the grate closed behind them. The sound of the contractors breaching the storage bay door rang out below as the two men crawled deeper into the ventilation system. The vent opened onto a maintenance walkway overlooking the compound's central operations floor. Below, monitors flickered with maps, security feeds, and tactical displays. Contractors rushed between stations, and at the center of it all stood the general, his sharp silhouette backlit by the glow of digital screens. Logan and Carter crouched behind a steel railing, their breaths steady as they observed the chaos below. There he is, Carter whispered, his rifle barrel following the general's movements. Logan's eyes narrowed as he studied the man who had orchestrated so much death and destruction. The general was calm, composed, issuing orders with the precision of a battlefield commander. We're running out of time, Logan said. If we don't stop him here, he'll just rebuild somewhere else. This ends now. Carter gave a grim nod. What's the play? Logan's gaze locked onto an electrical junction box mounted on the far wall. See that panel? If we disable it, we can knock out their security grid and communications. It'll blind them long enough for us to get to him. Cover me, Carter said, moving silently along the catwalk toward the panel. Logan adjusted his rifle, scanning the floor below as Carter worked quickly to bypass the junction box's controls. Sparks flew as Carter yanked out a handful of wires. Below, the operations room plunged into confusion as monitors flickered and went dark. Contractors shouted over crackling radios, their coordination fracturing. Systems down, a voice barked below. Find the breach. Now! Logan hissed. The two men descended a maintenance ladder, landing on the operations floor. Chaos reigned as contractors scrambled to restore order. Logan moved with lethal precision, his rifle barking short bursts as he advanced. Carter covered his flank, every shot deliberate and final. The general noticed them immediately. His cold eyes met Logan's from across the chaos, and a faint sneer curled at the edge of his mouth. "Hayes," the general said, his voice calm despite the pandemonium around him. Logan didn't hesitate. He fired a shot, but the general ducked behind a console, disappearing through a side door flanked by two heavily armed guards. "Go!" Logan barked, and he and Carter gave chase. The pursuit led them down a corridor lined with reinforced glass windows overlooking the compound's exterior. Floodlights illuminated the distant perimeter as contractors rushed to secure key positions. Ahead, the general moved with surprising speed, his two guards forming a protective barrier as they retreated toward a heavily secured command room. Carter fired, dropping one of the guards. Logan took out the second with a clean shot to the chest. The general slammed his palm against the control panel, and a thick steel door began sliding shut between him and his pursuers. "No!" Logan roared, sprinting forward. With a final burst of speed, Logan wedged himself into the narrowing gap, straining against the force of the hydraulic system. Carter grabbed his arm, pulling him through just before the door slammed shut behind them. They entered a dimly lit command center. Large screens displayed satellite feeds, weapons shipment routes, and live communication channels. At the far end of the room, the general stood calmly beside a reinforced desk, a sleek pistol resting in his gloved hand. "It's over," Logan said, his rifle trained on the general. "Your operation is done. The world will see what you've done." The general smirked. "You think this ends with me, Hayes? Men like me are a symptom, not the disease. Cut off one head, and another will rise." Carter stepped forward, his rifle steady. "Save the speech. You're done." The general's expression darkened, his finger twitching toward his pistol. Logan fired. The shot echoed through the chamber, and the general staggered back, clutching his chest as blood seeped through his uniform. His pistol clattered to the floor as he collapsed against the desk. For a long moment, the room was silent. Logan approached the fallen general, his boots clicking softly against the cold floor. He knelt beside the body, retrieving a small encrypted drive from the general's desk. Carter exhaled slowly, lowering his rifle. "Is it over?" Logan stared at the drive in his hand, his voice low. "Not yet. This data, it's the key to dismantling everything. Every contact, every deal, every corrupted official. But we have to get it out of here." The faint sound of distant boots echoed through the corridor outside. "They're regrouping," Carter said. Logan pocketed the drive, his expression resolute. "Then let's finish this." Side by side, Logan and Carter moved toward the emergency exit at the far end of the room, their rifles raised and their steps steady. The storm wasn't over yet, but its center had been shattered. The sky over Eagle's Rest was painted in shades of pale orange and muted gray as dawn broke over the shattered remnants of the small town. Smoke still curled from the distant horizon where the general's compound had burned through the night. The sharp scent of scorched metal and gunpowder lingered in the cold morning air. Amidst the chaos and devastation, a fragile silence had settled, a pause between the end of the battle and the uncertain beginning of what came next. Logan Hayes stood on a hill overlooking the smoldering ruins of the compound, his silhouette framed against the faint glow of the rising sun. His rifle hung loosely by his side, And the encrypted tablet, a device that had cost so many lives to protect, was strapped securely to his chest. Beside him, Carter Owen sat on a chunk of broken concrete, nursing a bruise along his jawline and occasionally flexing his aching fingers. "They're down there," Carter said, nodding toward a convoy of black SUVs and armored trucks crawling toward the compound below. "Feds. Cleanup crews, the suits have arrived." Logan said nothing, his sharp eyes scanning the scene below. Agents in dark uniforms fanned out across the compound grounds, marking evidence, securing crates of illicit cargo, and detaining the few surviving contractors who hadn't managed to escape into the hills. Helicopters hovered overhead, their rotor blades slicing through the cold morning air. "They'll lock this place down," Logan said finally, his voice low and firm. "Sanitize it. Erase every trace that this ever happened. But it won't be enough." Carter let out a dry chuckle. "It never is." Behind them, the crunch of gravel underfoot announced the arrival of Sheriff Neil Hargrove. His uniform was stained with soot and dirt, his face etched with exhaustion. Despite his battered appearance, his steps were steady, and his eyes still carried the same unwavering resolve. "Morning, gentlemen," Neil said gruffly. "Looks like the cavalry finally decided to show up." Logan turned to face the sheriff, his expression unreadable. "They're too late. The damage is done." Neil sighed and rubbed the back of his neck. "Maybe. But at least now someone's shining a light on this mess. What you two did back there, it gave us a chance." Logan's jaw tightened. "A chance isn't enough, Sheriff. The people behind this, those pulling the strings, they'll bury this if we let them. They'll rebuild somewhere else, with new names, new faces, and the same agenda." Neil crossed his arms over his chest, nodding slowly. "Then I guess it's a good thing you're not planning to let that happen." The faint hum of approaching engines drew their attention. A convoy of black SUVs rolled to a stop at the base of the hill. The doors swung open in perfect synchronization, and federal agents began stepping out, led by Special Agent Emily Cade. Emily was sharp-eyed and composed, her dark suit barely wrinkled despite the chaos surrounding her. She approached the trio with measured steps, her gaze flicking briefly to Logan before settling on the smoldering ruins in the distance. "You've caused quite a mess, Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice carrying a faint edge. Logan didn't flinch. A mess was the only way to get anyone's attention. Emily allowed herself a small nod of agreement before reaching into her coat and pulling out a sealed folder. She extended it toward Logan. "This contains everything we've pulled from the compound so far," Emily said. "Names, bank accounts, offshore holdings. But it's just a piece of the puzzle. The people funding this operation, they're not done. They'll fight to protect their interests." Logan took the folder, tucking it securely into his vest. "Then we'll fight harder." Emily's sharp gaze lingered on Logan for a moment longer before she stepped back, nodding briefly to Carter and Neil. "I suggest you all lay low for a while," Emily said. "There are people who won't be happy about what you've uncovered, and they have very long arms." Logan smirked faintly. "We're used to long odds." With that, Emily turned and walked back toward her convoy. The agents followed her lead, climbing back into their vehicles and disappearing into the smoke-drenched horizon. For a few moments, the three men stood in silence, watching the convoy fade into the distance. "What happens now, Logan?" Neil asked, his voice quieter this time. Logan stared down at the folder in his vest, his thumb brushing against its sealed edge. His voice was steady, resolute. "Now we make sure this doesn't get buried. We make sure every name in this folder answers for what they've done." Carter adjusted the strap on his rifle, his expression hardening. And where do we start? Logan looked out over the hills stretching into the distance. The faint outline of distant cities just visible on the horizon. We start wherever this trail leads us. The sun crested the horizon, bathing Eagle's Rest in pale gold light. Behind them, the shattered remains of the compound smoldered, smoke rising into the sky like the final breath of a dying beast. The storm had passed, but its echoes lingered in the air. Logan Hayes turned away from the wreckage, his footsteps steady as he began walking down the hill. There was still work to be done. The sky above Eagle's Rest had shifted from the fiery hues of dawn to a calm, clear blue. The town, scarred and battered, was beginning to stir with faint signs of life. The distant hum of cleanup machinery blended with the faint chatter of townsfolk emerging from their homes. Windows were being boarded up, debris swept away, and makeshift aid stations had been set up in the town square. Logan Hayes walked through the streets with Carter Owens and Sheriff Neil Hargrove flanking him. The trio moved with an air of quiet determination, their presence drawing silent nods of gratitude from the townspeople. Children peeked out from behind their parents, their wide eyes watching the men who had stood between them and annihilation. They're trying to rebuild, Neil said softly, tipping his hat toward an elderly man repairing a broken fence. But some things can't be fixed with nails and wood. Logan stopped walking, his sharp eyes sweeping over the square. They'll heal. It'll take time, but they'll heal. Carter adjusted his rifle strap. We gave them a fighting chance. That's more than most get. The group arrived at the steps of the sheriff's station. The once proud building was riddled with bullet holes, its facade charred from fire. Neil led them inside, where a few deputies worked to organize supplies and salvage records from water-damaged filing cabinets. Neil gestured toward his battered office. Come on. We should talk somewhere private. The office was dimly lit, the blinds partially drawn to block out the glare of the midday sun. Logan set the sealed folder from Agent Emily Cade on the desk, its weight almost symbolic. Carter leaned against a filing cabinet, arms crossed, while Neil took his seat behind the scorched wooden desk. What's in there, Logan? Neil asked cautiously, his gaze locked on the folder. Logan exhaled slowly. Names, accounts, locations. Everything tying the general's operation to a network of corrupt officials, corporate backers, and shadow operatives. Carter spoke up, his voice firm. This isn't just one man's crime, Sheriff. This is a system, a machine fueled by greed and power. Taking down the general was just one battle. The war's still out there. Neil leaned back in his chair, his expression heavy with exhaustion. And what do you plan to do with it? You think you can just expose these people and walk away? Logan shook his head. No. I don't expect to walk away. But this doesn't end here. We can't let it. The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of their mission settling like a stone in their chests. Finally, Neil spoke, his voice low but resolute. You'll have no backup, no reinforcements. You're taking on ghosts. Logan. Logan met Neil's gaze. Ghosts can bleed, Sheriff. We've seen that. Neil hesitated before giving a slow nod. Then you'd better make every shot count. Later that afternoon, the townsfolk had gathered in the square. Makeshift tables were set up with food and supplies, and volunteers moved between clusters of people offering water and blankets. A fragile sense of hope flickered in their tired eyes. Logan and Carter stood off to the side, observing the scene. Sheriff Neil stepped onto a crate in the center of the square and raised his voice. People of Eagle's Rest, these past days have tested us in ways we never thought possible. We've faced fear, violence, and loss. But we've also seen courage, sacrifice, and resilience. This town isn't just a collection of buildings, it's a home. And homes can be rebuilt. A faint murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Neil continued, his voice steady. Logan Hayes and Carter Owens fought to give us this chance. They risked everything to make sure this town, and the truth, didn't die in the dark. And now, it's up to us to make sure their fight wasn't in vain. Applause broke out. Hesitant at first, then growing louder as people turned to look at Logan and Carter. Logan gave a small nod but said nothing. Carter simply adjusted his cap and looked away. As night fell over Eagle's Rest, Logan and Carter stood at the edge of town. The glow of distant fires had finally faded, replaced by the flicker of streetlights and lanterns. Carter broke the silence first. So, where to next? Logan? You got names. You got leads. But what's the plan? Logan stared out at the dark horizon. The faint silhouette of distant cities barely visible against the sky. First, we disappear. Lay low. Regroup. Then we start chipping away at this, one name at a time. Carter smirked faintly. Back into the shadows. Huh. Logan glanced at his old friend. It's where we do our best work. From behind them, Sheriff Neal approached, his boots crunching against the gravel road. He handed Logan a small envelope. Some old contacts of mine. They're people you can trust, people who know how to keep quiet and still get things done. Logan took the envelope and tucked it into his jacket. Thank you, Neal, for everything. Neal gave a small, weary smile. Just make sure you finish what you started. Logan nodded. And with that, he and Carter turned and began walking into the darkness, their figures blending into the night. Above them, the stars stretched out endlessly across the sky. The battle for Eagle's Rest was over. But the war they had uncovered was just beginning. And Logan Hayes wasn't about to stop fighting. The faint light of dawn crept over the horizon, painting the sky in hues of pale pink and gold. Eagle's Rest sat in fragile silence, its streets still bearing the scars of conflict. Shattered glass glinted under the soft morning light, and faint trails of smoke curled from charred remains of what had once been homes and businesses. Yet amidst the devastation, life stirred. Volunteers carried crates of supplies. Families began to pick through the wreckage, and small groups worked tirelessly to clear debris. Logan Hayes stood at the edge of the town square, his figure still and resolute against the backdrop of rebuilding efforts. His tactical vest hung loose, and his rifle was slung casually over his shoulder. The encrypted drive, the fragile thread connecting every villainous cog in the general's operation, was tucked securely in his vest pocket. Nearby, Carter Owens leaned against an old lamppost, arms crossed, his rifle resting within reach. The faint hum of approaching engines cut through the quiet, and Logan turned his head as a convoy of black SUVs rumbled down the cracked main road. Their tinted windows and polished exteriors looked alien amidst the dusty ruins of the town. The vehicles came to a halt, and federal agents began stepping out, their presence sharp and businesslike. From the lead vehicle emerged Special Agent Emily Cade. Her sharp gaze swept across the square before locking onto Logan. Her coat fluttered slightly in the morning breeze as she approached him, her boots clicking against the uneven pavement. "Mr. Hayes," she said curtly, her eyes flicking briefly to Carter before settling back on Logan. "We've secured the compound. What's left of it? Anyway, cleanup teams are on site, and the last remaining pieces of evidence are being cataloged." Logan nodded slowly. "And the people on the list? The names connected to this operation?" Emily's lips pressed into a thin line. It's complicated. The general may be gone. But the web he wove is still intact. Powerful people are involved. And they're already working to cover their tracks. Carter let out a dry chuckle. Figures. Cut off one head. And another grows back. Emily's expression softened slightly. Her professional demeanor cracking just a little. You did good here. Both of you. But the fight's far from over. She pulled a small sealed envelope from her coat pocket and handed it to Logan. This contains contacts, people who can help you. People outside the system. Like you. Who still believe in accountability. But be careful. Once you start pulling on these threads, the people on the other end will pull back. Hard. Logan took the envelope and tucked it into his vest. His voice was low but steady. We knew the risks when we started. And we're not done yet. Emily hesitated before giving a brief nod. Good luck. Logan. Carter. With that, she turned and walked back toward her convoy. The agents followed suit, slipping back into their vehicles. Moments later, the SUVs rumbled back down the main road, leaving a cloud of dust in their wake. Sheriff Neil Hargrove approached from behind, his weathered face etched with exhaustion. His uniform was stained with ash and dust, but he walked with the unyielding posture of a man who had survived the storm. They'll wrap this up in a neat little bow, Neil said, stopping next to Logan. The suits will file their reports, pat themselves on the back, and move on to the next crisis. But you and I both know the rot goes deeper than a single operation. Logan nodded. That's why we're not stopping here. Neil. There's too much at stake. Neil sighed, glancing back toward the townsfolk still picking up the pieces. This place will heal. In time. But it won't ever be the same. People lost their homes. Their lives. And for what? Someone else's profit? Someone else's power? Carter stepped forward, his voice quiet but firm. We can't change what happened here, but we can make sure it doesn't happen again. Neil studied the two men for a moment before giving a faint nod. Whatever you two are planning next, be careful. You've made enemies, powerful ones. And they won't stop until they bury you. Logan offered his hand, and Neil shook it firmly. Thank you, Sheriff, for standing with us. Neil's voice cracked slightly. Just make sure you finish what you started. The sun had climbed higher by the time Logan and Carter made their way out of the town square. They walked side by side down an empty road leading toward the outskirts of Eagle's Rest. The distant mountains loomed in the background, their peaks kissed by morning light. Carter broke the silence first. So, what's the plan? Logan? We've got names, places, and enough evidence to make a dozen careers, or bury us both. Logan glanced at Carter, his expression unreadable. We lay low for a while. Study the data. Plan our next move. This isn't something we can rush. The people on that list didn't get where they are by being careless. Carter smirked faintly, back into the shadows. Then? Logan's voice was steady. For now. But we're not done. Carter. Not by a long shot. As they reached the crest of a hill overlooking the valley below, Logan paused and turned back toward Eagle's Rest. The town lay quiet under the rising sun, its people beginning the slow process of rebuilding what had been torn apart. Turning back to the road ahead, Logan adjusted his rifle strap and kept walking, Carter at his side. The road stretched out before them, winding into the unknown. They had survived the storm, but the fight was far from over. The distant hum of an old generator filled the cramped cabin with a low, rhythmic vibration. A single kerosene lamp flickered on a wooden table, casting dancing shadows across the walls. Logan Hayes sat hunched over a laptop, the faint glow of the screen illuminating the hard lines of his face. Across the room, Carter Owen sat in a rickety chair, cleaning his rifle with mechanical precision. Outside, the forest was cloaked in darkness. A fine mist clung to the trees, and the distant howl of a lone wolf echoed through the night. The safe house, a forgotten hunting lodge buried deep in the wilderness, was their temporary sanctuary. Here, they had space to breathe, regroup, and plan their next move. Anything yet? Carter's voice cut through the silence, steady but carrying an edge of impatience. Logan's fingers danced across the keyboard, his eyes scanning endless lines of decrypted data pulled from the encrypted drive. It's all here, Carter. Names, offshore accounts, facility blueprints, but it's not a straight path. It's a spiderweb. Every connection leads to another. Every lead buried under layers of false identities and shell corporations. Carter let out a sharp breath, leaning back in his chair. These people are ghosts. Logan, you think we can actually get to them? Logan didn't look away from the screen. They bleed, Carter. They all do. We just need to find the right thread to pull. Carter sighed, setting his rifle aside and walking over to the table. He pointed to a highlighted entry on the laptop screen. What about this? Some kind of shipment facility in Eastern Europe. Looks like it's still active. Logan's brow furrowed as he focused on the entry. Coordinates. Dates. A manifest list. It's a weapons depot. They're still moving shipments. This isn't over, not even close. Carter smirked faintly. Guess we know where we're headed next. Logan closed the laptop with a soft snap and rubbed his tired eyes. We'll need resources. Contacts. We can't just charge in guns blazing. This isn't like Eagle's Rest. We'll be deep in hostile territory with no backup. Carter crossed his arms, his expression resolute. When have we ever had backup? Logan? The two men shared a brief moment of understanding. They had been in impossible situations before. Outnumbered and outgunned. And yet they were still standing. The following morning, pale light crept through the thin curtains of the cabin. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine. Logan stood outside, staring into the fog-draped forest, a steaming cup of coffee in his hand. Carter emerged from the cabin a few moments later, carrying his packed gear. Trucks loaded, Carter said. We can be on the road in 10. Logan nodded, taking a slow sip from his cup. His eyes were distant, lost in thought. You ever wonder, Carter, if this fight ever ends? If there's a point where we stop chasing shadows? Carter let out a dry laugh. If you're looking for peace, Logan, you're in the wrong line of work. Men like us, we don't get endings. Just pauses between battles. Logan smirked faintly. Pauses don't last long. Do they? Carter shook his head, clapping Logan on the shoulder. Come on, partner. The world isn't going to save itself. The two men climbed into an old, dust-covered pickup truck parked nearby. The engine sputtered to life, and the vehicle rumbled down a narrow dirt road, disappearing into the mist. Miles away, in a pristine office perched high above a sprawling city skyline, a sleek phone buzzed on an ornate mahogany desk. Behind the desk sat a man in a tailored suit, his face hidden in the shadows cast by the early morning light filtering through thick blinds. The man picked up the phone and listened silently as a cold voice delivered the report. They're alive. Both of them. The drive was not fully compromised. And they've gone dark. The man set the phone down with deliberate care, his gloved hand tightening into a fist. Outside the window, the city below seemed impossibly distant. A sea of lights flickering beneath a gray sky. "Find them," the man said softly, his voice like ice. "And when you do, make sure they never resurface again." Back in the pickup truck, Logan drove in silence while Carter fiddled with an old map spread across his lap. The radio crackled faintly with static, playing a station barely clinging to its signal. "We'll need to make contact with someone reliable when we hit the border," Carter said. "We can't go in blind." Logan nodded. "I have someone in mind. An old friend. If they're still alive, they'll know how to get us inside without setting off alarms." The road stretched endlessly before them, winding through valleys and skirting along cliff edges. Every mile brought them closer to the next confrontation, to the next step in unraveling the web of corruption they had stumbled into. The sun began to rise behind them, casting long shadows across the rugged terrain. Carter glanced at Logan. "We'll get through this. You know. One way or another." Logan's eyes stayed on the road, his voice steady. "We have to, Carter. Because if we don't, no one else will." The truck roared forward, disappearing over a distant ridge as the horizon stretched infinitely ahead. In the shadows of power and greed, Logan Hayes and Carter Owens had become something unstoppable, an unrelenting force determined to pull the curtain back on the puppet masters controlling the world. And they wouldn't stop until every last name on that drive had been crossed off. The war wasn't over. It was just beginning. The sky over Eagle's Rest was painted in soft hues of orange and lavender as the sun dipped below the horizon. The small town, still bearing the scars of conflict, had begun to breathe again. New wooden beams replaced shattered storefronts, and fresh paint covered the charred remnants of homes. Life, fragile but resilient, had taken root amidst the ashes. Sheriff Neil Hargrove stood at the edge of Main Street, hands resting on his belt as he surveyed the slow rebirth of his town. Volunteers moved crates of supplies into makeshift shelters, while children laughed faintly in the distance. The weight of the past weeks hung heavily on his shoulders, but there was hope in his tired eyes. A battered pickup truck rumbled into town, its tires kicking up small clouds of dust as it slowed to a stop near the sheriff's station. From the driver's side, Logan Hayes stepped out, his familiar silhouette outlined against the fading light. Carter Owens followed, adjusting the strap of his rifle slung across his shoulder. Neil approached them with a faint smile. "Didn't think I'd see you two back here so soon." Logan extended a hand, and Neil shook it firmly. "Just passing through, Sheriff. Thought we'd check in." Carter smirked faintly. "Place looks better already." Neil glanced around, his smile bittersweet. "It's getting there. The people here, they're stronger than they realize." Logan reached into his jacket pocket and handed Neil a sealed envelope. Inside are names, locations, and account details. People who funded this mess. "It's not over, Sheriff. But this will help. Make sure it gets to the right hands." Neil took the envelope carefully, his brow furrowed. "You sure about this, Logan? This isn't something you can walk away from." Logan's gaze was steady. "We're not walking away. But we can't stay here either." The three men stood in silence for a moment, the weight of unspoken words lingering in the air. Finally, Neil nodded and tucked the envelope into his coat. "You take care out there," Neil said quietly. Logan gave a faint nod before turning back to the truck. Carter followed, pausing briefly to glance back at the sheriff. "Stay safe, Sheriff," Carter said with a small salute. Neil watched as the truck pulled away, its taillights glowing red as it disappeared down the winding road leading out of Eagle's Rest. Miles away, deep in the wilderness, Logan and Carter stood at the edge of a wide riverbank. The night was calm. The stars above scattered like shards of glass across an infinite black canvas. Logan stared out at the water. His voice low. "This isn't over." "Carter." "Not by a long shot." Carter adjusted his cap and smirked. "It never is." "Logan." "But we're still here. And we've still got work to do." Logan pulled the encrypted drive from his jacket pocket. The cold metal catching the faint moonlight. Inside was the roadmap to the enemy's remaining operations, a puzzle they would spend months, maybe years, unraveling. As the wind stirred the trees around them, Logan slipped the drive back into his pocket and turned away from the river. "Come on," he said, his voice steady. "We've got a long road ahead. Together." Logan Hayes and Carter Owens walked into the shadows of the forest, their figures disappearing into the night. The world was still broken, still corrupted by hidden hands pulling invisible strings. But somewhere in those shadows, two men carried the light of truth, an ember against the darkness. And they weren't finished yet.
They thought he was just a farmer, a forgotten man in a forgotten town. But when the storm of corruption and power threatens everything, the quiet hero in the shadows rises, and the cost will be unimaginable. Drop a comment and share where you're joining us from. If stories like this resonate with you, hit subscribe so you don't miss our next inspiring journey.